Test, test.
Okay, good morning. Thanks for coming in. It's a little chilly out, but the weather's playing nice today compared to some of the other days we've had. So glad you guys could make it. We got a pretty good lineup today. This is our last one. So some of you have been here for 6 weeks in a row, and you're probably ready to not come here anymore. I don't blame you. I get that way too, but I have to come here every day. So again, thanks for coming. This week we've got topics weather and markets, and so you've probably already talked about the weather and or markets already today. So clearly it's a topic that's on the front of a lot of people's mind, and it's changing all the time. So these slides are probably out of date now, since you put them together this morning. So anyway, so there's a lot that's going on in that world, so it's great to be able to bring you a couple speakers today. So we're sponsored today by the Lancaster County Farm Bureau. So if you know any Farm Bureau members, and I know a few of you are, make sure you tell them thanks. We appreciate their support. Larry and Rod here, I know, and others probably in the room, Burdette. So probably a number of you in the room that in the Farm Bureau. Yes, that's right, and myself. So, but we thank Farm Bureau. They support a lot of work that we do here in the county and even neighboring counties. So again, thanks to them, and if you know one, thank them. So yeah, today we've got Al Dutcher. We'll start up with him, but also have Amelia Breinig from the Department of Ag. And then we'll have Doug Simon with Tredas here after break. So he'll talk a little bit about markets. So without any further rambling, I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to Al. Al's an ag climatologist with the Nebraska State Climate Office. You've likely heard Al before and know Al, and probably even on first name basis. He's kind of a known figure around here. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can take it away. So thanks, Al.
Thank you, Tyler. It's a pleasure to be here. Tyler's given me about 45 minutes or so to talk and with questions. I'm going to try my best, and people who know me, I tend to ramble a little bit sometimes, but I'm going to do my best to stay within that. But if you do have questions, feel free to ask as we go through this. There will be a couple slide changes in this compared to what Tyler gave to you in your handout. I wanted to update some of the ENSO information in terms of the forecast, and this is going to be very important. You'll see as we go through this talk why it will be important. But the hint is it looks like more and more like we're going to go into a La Nina event this year, and in the past, historically, that has led to some drier conditions in the western Corn Belt. So we'll get into that. Before we get into the drier part of the forecast, we've got to get through the wetter part of the forecast, unfortunately, and we know it's been wet for the last year. We had a very aggressive precipitation pattern late last winter, and that pretty much held for the majority of the spring. We were fortunate enough to get enough drying in there that we were a little bit farther ahead than our counterparts to the east in terms of planting, but we still had some prevent plant, and of course it got hit by the the earlier freeze in October due to the late planting. Most of the crops in Nebraska fared fairly well, but as you go to the north and to the northeast, there's a lot of standing corn in the fields in eastern portions of the Dakotas and western Minnesota. There's a tremendous amount of snow still on the ground with an unfrozen soil underneath of that snow. So they not only got to evacuate that snow, they're going to have to get the crops harvested before they can even train the thought of getting in the fields and planting. And based on the soils up there being very tight, high-packed, or very tight clay soil, the odds are that they're going to require some very windy conditions and some very warm temperatures for an extended period of time to get those surfaces dried out enough to hold up to the typical planting activity that goes on as we go into the spring. And farther to the east, I think the major issue is because of all of the excessive water that has been draining off from last year. We continue to have high flows, and we're going to have some problems as we go forward if we get any semblance of normal to above normal precipitation. But before we get to that, I base a lot of my forecasts on what's going on in the oceans and then try to confine that or combine that with the atmospheric patterns to try to get an idea of where we're going forward in time. So I'm going to show you two graphs here. The first one is from last October as we entered the fall recharge period. Typically we define that as October 1st through the end of April. That's when we look at subsoil moisture as a precursor to the growing season. If we're above normal, we're in a little bit better shape. If we're below normal, then we get concerned. And so then we look at the atmospheric patterns, and one of the things I'll show you draw your attention to is if you look at the Gulf of Alaska, a very warm pattern. Now this has been a blob of heat that has been there now for the better part of 2.5 years, and really developed though during the last strong El Nino event, and we've had that residual heat. If you look at the eastern equatorial Pacific, and that would be the region, essentially, I don't know if this is working or not, but essentially it's the region in the eastern half of the equatorial Pacific. You'll notice that cold pocket there. This is what we call a bimodal pattern. It's cold in the eastern portion of the equatorial Pacific, and it's warm in the central equatorial Pacific, or we see a vice versa, warm and cold. But this bimodal pattern means that we can see both El Nino and La Nina type patterns in the upper atmosphere. And this started to show up. This little cold pocket showed up about the time last February when we seen that big sharp increase of cold air coming in as that come to the surface. And it's been a player ever since, but it has not expanded. And part of the problem is the amount of heat that's in the equatorial Pacific, central equatorial Pacific, and at depth has taken a while to get rid of this heat blob. But notice a change that we have seen since October 1st. And this is why I'm highly confident that we're going to see La Nina conditions develop, and the numerical models are coming that way also. But if you look at the Gulf of Alaska, you'll notice that we have lost almost 2/3 of the heating from that above normal from October. And really what has happened is that low pressure system that usually sits over the eastern Aleutian Islands has drifted a little bit farther toward the east. So the jet stream pattern itself has responded to that, and we're not seeing as many storms coming out of the south and southwest as we did last winter. We're getting more of a northerly component with a weaker southern jet stream. So these big storms that are coming in just don't have the drive to them to move toward the northeast, and they basically are drifting toward the east until the next wave in the northern stream comes into the Pacific Northwest and kind of kicks it out. Well, the biggest issue for us has been the position of the northern jet, because if the northern jet lies over the northern plains, those little lows that come into the southwest and then basically drift eastward, because the flow is coming out of the north, get pushed basically southward and eastward, and then they move up the eastern seaboard as they merge with that upper air trough. Whereas last winter, we had a displacement of the northern jet such that those systems were able to freely just move toward the north and east without being deflected toward the east. That's been the primary difference. So when you look at Lincoln and look at the snowfall that we have seen this winter, and we'll get to that in a while here, but just look down the number of events, we're really not different in terms of frontal boundary passages from last year. It's the source of the moisture. It's coming more from the north. So instead of getting those 3 to 6 inch snows that we've seen on regular occasion with all our events here in the southeast part of the state last winter, we're getting those 1/2 inch to 1.5, 2 inch events. And that has led to a significant decline. And if you remember last year, it was at about this time, well, we were already a week into the cold weather, but it was about this time when we started to really kick up the snowfall across the western part of the state. And from this point forward last year until we got to the middle of March, most locations of the state received anywhere from 20 to 30 inches of snowfall. So good news is that from a numerical model standpoint, there is nothing in the forecast that would indicate that we're going to see that type of precipitation pattern develop. Therefore, feel fairly comfortable. But you also notice that we're starting to see some cold coming into the central equatorial Pacific, and that's coming from the currents coming up the west coast of South America, coming out of the Arctic Circle region, and then moving to the central equatorial Pacific. This is very important because this area that you see here in the last few months has been to the south of where we see it right now, and so that cold was coming into the south of the equatorial region. Now we're starting to see it shift up toward the north. So that's going to reinforce the cool conditions at the surface, and it should, to some extent, break this up. And most importantly, when I look at the phase changes in the North Pacific, looking at the Gulf of Alaska turning colder, we look into the western Aleutian Islands to see if we get a corresponding warming of the surface conditions. That is the final nail in the coffin, so to speak, for La Nina conditions. We want to see high pressure develop over that region as a confirmation that we're going to see that area increase in terms of sea surface temperatures, and its deviations will start getting warmer and warmer, and that will reinforce the cold that is in the in the Gulf of Alaska. So when we look underneath the surface, this is where we try to figure out how long is this event going to occur, or is it going to strengthen? And what you'll notice is one of the precursors that I've said in the past is we watch the western equatorial Pacific underneath the surface to start to see the confirmation of below normal temperatures occurring. And as that expands, it has the ability to start being pulled underneath of that warm pocket, and you kind of see the channel that is forming here. So once that starts working underneath of that warm pocket, and it starts working on the surface, you start squeezing that layer both from the top and the bottom and basically take that heat out of the system. But you can see that basically there is a trough coming from the western equatorial Pacific with no real big warmth there to basically say that this is going to be a short-lived event. So we've got, typically we figure 3 months from the central equatorial Pacific to get to the eastern equatorial Pacific. Looks like we've got 6 months minimum of this cold pocket moving underneath that is going to continue to feed into the eastern equatorial Pacific. Therefore, CPC puts a consolidation of the models together across the globe that try to predict these ENSO events, El Nino Southern Oscillation. So the 0 line represents the transition between a warm and a cool equatorial Pacific. The global atmospheric models all point to what they think is going to happen, and then we consolidate them. So if you look at the red line, this is very important because this is from last month's update, and this is where the first slide change is going to be on the next one. The crossover point on the red, which is the average of the models, occurs at the very end in July, August, September. Now look at what has happened in the last 30 days. That crossover point has been moved all the way back into the May, June, and July period, between the April, May, and July period. It doesn't get real cold, but you'll notice that compared to the previous runs, we had a couple models that were very cold. Now, when we go forward, we've almost doubled the number of models, and they've intensified the depth of the cold. I would not be surprised this will be a very strong event. And the reason I say that is when we look at past La Nina and El Nino events, those that begin to develop during the spring period and reach La Nina characteristics by the time we get to the end of the summer tend to be the very strong ones. They also tend to really impact the northern jet stream. And one of the things we see is a lack of significant snowfall in the southern Rockies and an expansion of that area as we go into the summer. So snowpack becomes a big, big issue, and of course the jet stream pattern. And what we have seen over this last 60 days has been a transition from the very cold fall period where we had very significant temperatures coming in, a lot of snowfall that supported the trough in the eastern United States, to one that supported more troughiness in the western United States, not to the extent of last winter, but we've seen a blocking ridge develop, excuse me, in the southeastern United States. So we had a couple pretty good storms that come out of that. At the end of October, had one run down the front range of the Rocky Mountains, and then two that ejected out of the southwest that impacted us. The one right post-Thanksgiving and the one post-Christmas. If we took all of those out of the equation, we really haven't had much of a winter period. It was those three events that represented the vast majority of the snowfall that we've seen across the state. So it is a completely different winter, to sort of speak. Thankfully, that those lows that have been ejecting out, the vast majority of them moved to our south. And so the area that's been impacted the most over this last 60 days has been the southeastern United States. As those troughs move, as that systems move across the southern border or southern United States, they merge with the northern jet over the eastern United States and then run up the eastern seaboard, and we've been seeing just one big rain event after another. Well, if you look at the time and the length of the patterns that we've been into, when we were in the cold stretch in October, started at the end of September, it lasted all the way to the middle of November. From the middle of November to the middle of January, and roughly there's a difference of 4 or 5 days there, we were more in a pattern that supported weak troughing in the southern stream in the southwest. And now we have moved into more of a northern stream. We're getting more of these cold air, just like last winter. So we started this pattern in the middle of, I shouldn't say the middle, about the 10th of January is when we reverted over this. So now we're into week number 4 to 5 of this northern stream pattern. So if we think of this logically, that most of the atmospheric patterns go through a phase change every 6 to 8 weeks on average in the northern hemisphere, meaning that your troughs and your ridges will tend to switch up on a regular basis. That puts our phase change here within the next week to 3 weeks. So sometime within this next 1 week period all the way into early March, we should see a phase change that would be some more supportive of getting more action coming out of the southern stream, out of the southwest. So we get to move into a more critical period. And if we're looking at this time of the year, our temperatures are generally on the increase. More warm air holds more water. So the concern is that these systems will start to juice up and cause a renewed concern in regards to flooding. Well, NOAA put out a flood statement. They put out a flood statement last fall. And I'm going to tell you, the first time in my career and I've been doing this 30 years here for the university, that we've seen a flood statement for the next spring issued in the fall from NOAA. That tells you how concerning the situation was because of the excessive moisture. But more importantly, the newest updates came up here at the end of January to separate this out by basins. And I would encourage you to go visit these sites to get a more full detail of how they've taken each of these basins out and broken it out into the areas that are most likely to see significant issues as we go into this spring period. Now, we'll also get a spring flood risk outlook here within the next probably 30 days as we get close to the end of March. That'll be our true spring outlook. So this flood statements here not only look at the spring rainfall, but they're also looking at conditions right now and what will happen with the spring melt-off of our snow. Well, for here in Nebraska, we're in pretty doggone good shape. There's just a lack of snow cover, sustained snow cover. So barring a return to extremely cold temperatures, if you noticed yesterday, the temperatures, I happened to go to National Weather Service to see how much we departed from normal. It was 20 degrees. And I would remind you that last year, we've seen a similar situation at after we got through the first 2 days of February, we turned very cold. And I'll use Valentine as a proxy. For the first 2 weeks of last year, Valentine's maximum temperatures averaged 15 degrees below normal. For the last 2 weeks of February, temperatures averaged 19 degrees below normal on the highs. The first 2 weeks of March, we averaged 24 degrees below normal at Valentine. So barring those type of patterns, it's going to be very hard for us to set any frost. And that's a good thing because in my travels these last 2 weeks, one of the major concerns has been the ice jams and the situation from last year. And with the high flows, there was a lot of concern. There's just a lack of significant ice, and a lot of it has to do with these high flows. So I look at it as more of a benefit. We're draining off water, excessive water from last year, continually through this winter with these high flows. Normally, we would have the ground froze up to an extent that we would see these flows drop in the wintertime. That's a normal response on our streams. As the ground frost goes down deeper in the profile, you lose more of that water coming in. So we're actually evacuating water that we typically wouldn't during the winter, and that's a good thing because we are very saturated. The flip side of this is that if we get the perfect conditions, the vast majority of the Corn Belt's got a full profile of moisture. So get the perfectly timed rainfalls during the summer and even have a drier pattern than normal, and we're going to be looking at some pretty big yields coming out of the U.S. if we can get through the spring planting period unfazed. That's the big if. So here's your current 28-day stream flow. And it kind of shows you that we're aggressively wet. In Nebraska, the 3 basins that are the most prone to flooding this year are going to be the Loop, the Big Blue, and then, of course, those that enter into the Missouri River. And really, from our standpoint, the vast majority of the river flows coming into the Missouri, where the problems lie, are on the east side of the Missouri River. And if you look up into northwestern Iowa, all the way down west central Iowa into southwest Iowa, all of those tributaries entering into the Missouri River Basin are shown in black here at the 99% level. That means that we're either at the highest or the second highest in recorded history in regards to these stream flows. So there's a lot of water that has to be drained out. This is the same area that had a lot of problems in terms of planting last year. This is the same area right now that is in the prime area for the intersection of these 2 jet streams. And so these precipitation patterns that have been basically just skirting to our south of us and then moving up the eastern portion of the United States have been inundated them. And they're close enough to the northern stream that if they miss the southern stream, they're still getting the snows from the northern stream across the northern half of Iowa and southern Minnesota. So this does look to be a very aggressive pattern, but I will caution you that because of the drainage that they do have in their fields and the tiling, that we can get a 2-week stretch of dry weather. A lot of things can dry out really fast, at least to the surface, to get the plants planted. In the same token, those wet conditions are going to take some aggressive growth and some aggressive vegetative growth this spring before we get into planting for us to make some room for additional precipitation events. And that's going to be the major issue for us going forward. I will draw your attention to the southwest part of the state. Now, as much as we've had moisture here in the east, they've turned dry last fall. They've caught in a couple of precipitation events. But overall, they are on the northern end of a pretty sizable area of dryness that has developed both in the short and the long term across the United States. If you look at the southern Rockies, where most of the major snowstorms last year inundated this region with anywhere from 150 to 200% of normal snowfall for the year, we're going completely opposite. And the year before, we had record low snowpack across the entire state of Colorado, and then we dipped to almost record above normal snowpack, and now we're slipping back the other way. As bad as it is, this region is still pretty close to normal in terms of snowpack, and most of it, again, was from those two primary storms, Thanksgiving and Christmas. Since then, we've dropped from 150, depending on location, 150 to 200% of normal at the end of December, to we're basically in the normal to about 120% of normal right now. The reason for it is this region, just to stay even, needs to see at least one, if not two of these snowstorms a month to keep that snowpack up. And they peak out on their snowpack in early April in the very southern Rocky Mountains. About mid-April as you get into I'd say about the southern one-third of Colorado, so northern New Mexico, early April, middle of April for the southern one-third, and then the 1st of May as you get up into the northern Rockies. So if this next 30 to 45 day period is a bust, we would expect the snowpack to rapidly dissipate as we get into the warmer season. And then usually what happens downstream from there is you lose that lack of moisture in the upper atmosphere, you don't get your convection on the east side of the Rocky Mountains, and you see that drought start to expand. So that's why there's a concern up into southwest Nebraska and the Panhandle, is simply a reflection that the storms that have come out this winter, although they have given us above normal precipitation in eastern Nebraska and points of northwestern Nebraska, it has contributed to a dry slot, and that's very, very, very common with lows coming out of southwest, that there will be a dry slot where the circulation pulls air from the southwest, and it just so happens right now it lies in western Nebraska. So we do have to get through this dry stretch this spring in order for us to feel comfortable that we'll have normal precipitation for the Corn Belt in Nebraska. But it also is a forewarning that with La Nina conditions and a ridging pattern likely developing in the western United States, that this really needs to be watched critically, because it can really start to expand rapidly toward the north if we indeed see a lack of active weather in the southern stream. More importantly, if this starts to melt off quicker, we can start to see it erode the central Rocky snowpack. And then that starts to have a direct impact on the western one-third of the state. And that's why we're watching this area closely. So, give you an idea of snow totals, and I updated these through last night. There is a huge difference in the snows. Look at Lincoln and Omaha, and I think, and personally, I also track the snowfall in Lincoln. I'd say 10.9 has been very generous to Lincoln. There's been a few of these that were given as 1-inch snowfalls that was really stretching it. I've got about 8 inches at my place, so they're about 3 inches differential. But snow measurements are notoriously hard to get a good, accurate measurement. But when you start to do a seasonal comparison between years, there's where you start to see the differences. And we're running almost a third of last year. And look at where we're at, 28.9 last year at this point in time, and yet we ended up over 50 inches of snowfall. So it kind of gives you an idea of the snow that was yet to come. And then you look at the remainder of the state that's seen a more aggressive snow pattern this year, and they were really lacking in the snow last year. And as I said, before it was all said and done with, everybody was normal to above normal in snowfall. So a lot of snow fell in a short amount of time during this period and contributed to the problems. If we look at the snowpack, everything that you can see, this is an updated map, so it's not going to conform to the one that you're showing here. This is basically looking at how things stand as we look through this morning. You can kind of see that southern stream and how things have missed us. So the snow that come out of that low and out of the southwest did not carry a strong band all the way into the northern part of New Mexico. It wasn't until it got into the eastern halves of Oklahoma and Texas where we started to see the heavier snowfall. But you can see that southerly stream, how it moves out and it's moving south of the state. Last year, this was just displaced to the north about a half a state. So instead of hitting southern Kansas, we were hitting southeastern Nebraska. And then as we moved through the spring, that just kept moving up toward the north and the northwest. The only areas with sustained snowpack at this point in time are the eastern Dakotas and northern Minnesota. And this is the area of major concern. The Upper Peninsula of Michigan, yeah, there's concern for heavy precipitation there. But being from Michigan, I can tell you, you don't have to worry about much in the way of crops there. The big crop up there is the timber industry. There is very little agriculture there, small dairy farms here and there. But for the most part, it's a lot of cedar swamps and It's a lot of hardwood forests up in that region. So I'm not too concerned about that region, but certainly Wisconsin and southern Minnesota. And the reason why this is important is because this is at the headwaters of the Mississippi River Valley. This is where the real problem started in 1993. So if we get any type of semblance of aggressive patterns coming out of the western United States and start to get big into our big storm patterns in the spring, with that snowpack on there, if we put a warm layer over top of that, like we did in Nebraska last year with rainfall, we're going to have a mess on our hands coming downstream, and then we'll see whether it builds on itself. It's going to take a very dry March to get this moisture out of the system at the surface, enough that we can feel comfortable that at least from the spring flood outlook, the snow itself will not be the major contributor. It's going to have to be the spring rains. But they're in a world of hurts up there, and I really don't see any way out of it because they're in a prime area of getting precipitation, and they continue to be. So here's kind of a summary of things. We have seen a drying trend in the northern Rockies, but that's not unusual during the wintertime. The jet stream comes through in the fall, sags to the south. As it returns back to the north, they get the later spring snows, and we do here, even here in western Nebraska. So this next 45-day period will be critical to them. Why do I say that? Because look at the absence of snowfall. All of the snow that we've had, there's an absence of snowfall across the state and up the front range of the Rocky Mountains. So if that snow doesn't come there, the second dry area to worry about is in the northwestern Corn Belt. So now we're worrying about the southern Rockies and the northwestern Corn Belt. We go through La Nina, we start to see the erosion of that snowpack in the south as the ridge starts to build north. It doesn't take much to figure that it doesn't have to only move through the central Rockies to merge up with that dry pocket there. And now we have a big standing ridge all the way up through the northern Rockies and into the southern Rockies. And generally when that builds up, we start to see it expand toward the east, loosens up or weakens the Hudson Bay Trough, deflects the jet stream in a northwest flow more toward our north and to our east. And generally during the summer, the beneficiaries are the areas of Iowa, Illinois, as that ridge comes downstream. So they might get the timely rainfalls, or they might get just a continuation of excessive rainfall events on them. So in one situation would be a positive form, and the other would be a negative. And right now, the negatives overwhelm the positives from the or from the Nebraska border eastward. The area of Nebraska that I would be most concerned about at this point in time would be northeast Nebraska and all along the Missouri River Basin. And I'm sorry that those folks that do have land along the Missouri River Basin are likely to go through a very tough year this year. It's just going to take a couple precipitation events and the river's going to come back out of its banks. I fully expect that that's going to happen at some point. So let's look at the individual, because what determines the irrigation requirements in western Nebraska, we look at the Platte River basins and its potential to contribute to the flooding situation this spring. So if we look at the North Platte River Basin, this is the one that's going to go through Seminole, Pathfinder, and then come up through North Platte and then down into McConaughey. The problem with this region is that we haven't had much of irrigation demand the last few years, so we have really high reservoir levels. There's not a lot of room to store the entire snowpack. So we need to have a nice gradual release of that snowpack in order for CMPPID to be able to control the flows coming out of McConaughey. They can hold it back to a certain point, but at some point you have to start releasing it. So if you have a gradual snow melt, you can push that off later into the year when we typically see our flows drop as we respond to the more drier conditions that occurred with our warmth, and of course with irrigation and the native vegetation. I will draw your attention also to last year, and if you look at the blue line, you can notice that this has actually jumped up quicker than last year, so we're ahead of last year's pace. But if you look at last year, it was just a continuous string, and we never actually peaked out until our typical time. But anytime we started to melt it, we jumped back up 50% of what we lost, and we just continued to add on to that. So we had a very extended melt period, and you'll notice that we never really lost our snowpack completely until we got to the middle of July, which is highly unusual. One of the things that we watch here in the Platte River Basin is for that snowpack to disappear by late May and early June. When that happens, we tend to see dryness issues develop rather rapidly across western Nebraska. So as long as this keeps building, we don't have to worry about that part of the issue. Then we start to worry about excessive amount of water up there and how it's going to come downstream. But you will also notice that we get long sustained periods where there's no precipitation. So this peak could actually start to drop. We're getting that time of the year we can start to see some pretty significant drops in these peaks depending on what the weather in the southern Rockies does. And that'll be the thing to watch for. But the one that concerns me more than anything is the South Platte River Basin, because we can't control this one, and all the streams on that branch, or I mean all the reservoirs on that branch, excuse me, that come through the system are very small reservoirs, and they're full. So that water's going to pass through. There's not much we can do that because that flow is going to come in east of McConaughey. That'll be the contributing flow right now for the higher flows this spring if we don't even get any precipitation. So we're going to have to deal with the high flows coming out of this. And unless we see a rapid decline in the snowpack, my suspicion is that this trend will probably stay above normal for this small basin. Thankfully, this isn't the biggest of the two basins that contribute to the Platte flows. And this basin usually goes off pretty quick. And you can kind of see that because even where the other one was dissipated as we got in the middle of July, fully, we lost this basin a full 2 weeks before the North Platte Basin. So it does dry out much quicker. The biggest contributor to this basin will be southwest ejecting lows where we get upslope flow. This is the area to the west of Denver and the west of Boulder that contributes through, and it is highly dependent on upslope flow conditions along the Front Range, whereas the Central Rockies can get both the southwest feeding flow, the north feeding flow, and systems that eject out into the plains. It has a much more dynamical response to systems coming through the region. So now we are looking at these pattern changes, and I mentioned this before, these 6 to 8 week pattern changes. You'll notice that the month of October was exceptionally cold. Systems coming in the Pacific Northwest, dropping a lot of snow across the northern Rockies, bringing the cold air down into our region, and then swinging up toward the Great Lakes as we had a blocking high pressure into the southeast. So we had that northern stream was very active. It held till the middle of November. And then if we look at the precipitation, once again, you can see the ejection of those southwesterly lows coming to the south of us. Not a lot of precipitation in our region during the month of October, except for extreme eastern Nebraska. Most of the west was drier than normal. The heaviest precipitation was over northern Iowa and points off to the north and east. So you can kind of see to some semblance a little southward and eastward movement in the northern stream, still picking up some of the moisture from the southern stream. And the one that we see here in eastern Nebraska was the late October snow event in western Nebraska. And so even with that big snow event, we don't see above normal moisture. Simply, they didn't have anything up till that event during the month. And even though there was a lot of snow involved with it, the water content of that snow, because it was so cold, was not that strong. The last 90 days, and this is only updated through the end of, and I want to do this so that we could take this, try to take the December and January contributions to this. We noticed a small cold pocket that developed over the northern plains, and this is when we started to change over in January. So what we have seen since the 10th of January to the end of January in this cold pocket is the major contributor to that. Outside of this, we were running 6 to 8 degrees above normal across the northern plains up till the early January. So at this time of the year, with our daily temperatures increase on an average of 1 degree every 2.5 to 3 days across the state, we get these late surges of cold air, and it can really screw up, to some extent, the averages for the winter because we're dropping so much compared to normal. Just like yesterday's totals were 20 degrees below normal, simply because we dropped down to the below normal range and we only had highs of 16 when we should be seeing highs around 40. So you get 3 or 4 of these days in here, you may be 4 or 5 degrees above normal, and all of a sudden you're back to normal. That's how rapidly it can occur because that cold's coming at the end of the season when we're rapidly rising. And it starts to get rather dramatic as we get into March, where we typically should be seeing highs in the mid-40s and above, and moving to the mid-50s and above by the middle of March. So we get a stretch where we're in the 30s here, and now we're 25, 30 degrees below normal, and that gets progressively harder to make up. So really, we may see some changes in this a little bit for February. We're a little bit above normal the start of February. I was looking at Lincoln, and one day we dropped basically for the month because of this cold air. We went from 3 degrees above normal to a 1.5 degrees above normal in one day for the month. That's how rapidly things can change. But more importantly, you can kind of now see what I'm talking about on the southwest low. You look in the southwest, the vast majority of that was those 2 events that I mentioned. You can see that some of that came out into the central plains. But the vast majority of the heavier departures from normal are well to our southeast. And one of the concerns that I have is that in Texas is right along the Gulf Coast where we're starting to see a pretty dry pocket develop. Of course, our front winds come out of the south during the spring period. So we're going to need the atmosphere to wet that surface up. So we're going to lose some dynamical moisture in the atmosphere to wetting up that atmosphere from the dry conditions at the surface. That's less of it that's going to be evected toward the north. As long as we got those lows ejecting out, we have a chance to at least pull moisture up into our region. But if we go dry during the month of March, and this area begins to continue to expand as these systems really get their act organized into eastern Texas and points off to the east, then the most likely scenario is this is going to reinforce a dryness that we have seen materialize in the southwestern portion of the winter wheat belt, northern Texas, southwestern portions of Kansas, and southeastern portions of Colorado. Excuse me. So I want to go through the jet stream pattern to kind of give you an idea of what I'm talking about before we summarize everything and try to figure out where in heck we might be going. When I mentioned that we should start to see a phase change, one of the things we need to do is see energy in the southwest. So you see that ridge going up into the Gulf of Alaska. You can see the energy coming over top of that ridge down the western coast of North America. But one of the problems you have when you have these troughs, in order for a trough to really cause a lot of problems across the country, you want to see a standing wave that moves basically in a fashion from east to west. When you start tilting like this, you have essentially an energy in the northern stream. I can't make this thing work, but the northern stream energy and the southern stream energy, and they're starting to split apart. And when you tilt them, the northern stream energy is moving eastward at a quicker rate than the southern stream, and they kind of get ripped apart from each other. Kind of show you this. So you see that you're starting to see a separation. The northern stream comes down, basically makes a right-hand turn right here around Nebraska, and then moves eastward. And then on the backside of that, you see the cold air funneling down on the backside of that low in the southwest, and then you see that it comes back up into the southeastern United States. So because these are not in one uniform pattern, you're getting most of your energy around that low pressure system, but because the northern stream energy is coming like this, it deflects that moisture to the south and east of Nebraska. It just can't flow up into the northern plains. So most of the moisture that we're seeing here with these precipitation events lately have been associated more with the northern stream than they have been with the southern stream. So then we take this a day. Now here is an example, and this is basically the storm system we just dealt with. You see that now as they get to the east of Nebraska, that southern stream, everything merges and we get a uniform trough. It's that type of a trough that we want to see coming across the entire United States for us to get really concerned about heavy moisture being flowed to the north. So as long as those two streams are not moving in concert with each other, we're going to continue this trend of splitting the energy both to the north and south of Nebraska. And that could be a good news for us, get us through some of the more critical wetness issues that we have and allow the streams to drain off some more water before we get into our regular semblance of normal precipitation. But more importantly, as we take this a little bit farther on 4, you can start to see that that trough lifts up. But yet another trough is coming down the western seaboard. And you'll notice that we're leaving some energy in the southwest. Now this is the model projections that were from 2 days ago for the storm system looking out for a week. And I mentioned about that expectation of a pattern change as we moved into the end of the month, the early part of next month. You can kind of see that it's trying to do that by carving out a weak trough from that energy coming out of the Gulf of Alaska. There's not a lot of energy around it, but we're starting to see the formation of a trough. And what we're required now is to keep reinforcing that trough. As this trough in the east lifts up, we start to see high pressure building in, and that'll direct those southwest flow into our region. If this does not relax to the point where it lifts up toward the Canadian border and still carves out a little troughing pattern over the northern plains and the Great Lakes, then these systems coming out of the southwest most likely going to be continually deflected south of the state more than coming directly across the state, as I had mentioned before. So here you can kind of see you have this troughing pattern here, and you can kind of see that we're starting to the southern stream is staying well to our south as that energy moves around it. Under this type of a situation, I will mention this, and this is a huge risk going forward, and I fully expect to see this before this winter is out. When you have that eastern U.S. trough like this and a disassociation when you separate around it, if one of these lows manages to get into the southwest and cuts off and kind of drifts toward the east, that trough lifts up and kind of starts to drift out, and the next trough comes in and doesn't come down the west coast, but starts to come in the Pacific Northwest and starts to strengthen this. You basically start to carve out a trough across the northern plains, and this low kind of drifts toward the north. As it drifts toward the north, it's bringing that warm air up. So if the cold air gets here before the warmth from the southern stream gets into the central plains, then you have a perfect overrunning situation. We've had a lot of those freezing rain events and freezing drizzle events here in the southeast, as we just caught a little bit of that precipitation. But the problem is we warm the atmosphere up, it holds more moisture, and your icing events tend to be more significant in the spring than they do during the wintertime. This is the perfect scenario for this type of a pattern. I fully expect we'll see an ice storm somewhere in the central United States before this winter is out. Not uncommon. Right now, it would be extreme eastern Nebraska and Iowa, because that's kind of the intersection of these points. If we're lucky, we'll escape this, but I really do believe we're set up for an icing event. More importantly, the northwestern part of the state is where it's more difficult, because we are starting to get into calving season. The question is, if we get an icing event here, are we going to get the heavier snow in the northwest? And that's the open-ended question right now for me, is do we start to get more southern stream energy and this northern portion basically remains over the northern plains, or does it shift back toward the cold air is coming in over the northern Rockies? If this troughing pattern moves in the northern stream, moves over the northern Rockies, then we'll see a big increase in snowfall across the northern plains. But if this pattern continues, most of it's going to be deflected away to the east of the Rocky Mountains, and we'll see that area fall apart. So these are the things that we've got to go through for this spring in order for it to have a semblance of any idea of how this growing season is going to go, and it can go both ways. And this is one of the few times that I'm going to say I really don't know which way it's going to go, but my suspicion is we will gradually work drier, particularly as this La Nina event itself unfolds. So one of the things that we didn't mention earlier, and I apologize for that, was our frost depth. We just don't have the frost depth this year. We're tracking this with the Mesonet. You can go and visit this site looking at the daily tab at the mesonet.unl site. We've got frost depths of the 2, 4, 8, 20, and 40-inch depths. And this is kind of a summation. I did not look at it this morning. I suspect that we may have seen a degree change in the upper profiles, probably up to the 8 profile, but the 20 and 40 have been fairly consistent. You'll notice nowhere in the state that 20 inches are we at the freezing mark. We're actually a couple of degrees above that. That warmer and very warm as we get down the 40-inch layer. Best we can associate is that we've got between 8 and 12 inches of frost in the northern third of the state, between 8 and 10 inches the central 1/3 and the southern third, somewhere between 6 and 8 inches. That's going to vary on a given day. What we've accumulated these last 2 days, or today and yesterday, with these very cold temperatures will probably be undone because we're going to jump up into the 50s. And we've seen that consistently over the last 2 weeks, that these totals, these numbers have not changed much. I haven't really had to vary these maps very much, simply because when we do get a few days of cold, we immediately follow it with a few days of well above normal temperatures, and that kind of offsets each other. So if we do get this warmer trend that is showing up in the models to come in as we get through into next weekend and into the last full week of the month, my suspicion is we're going to remove most of the frost depth across the state. I'm a firm believer in watching the wildlife. I got interested in this field from my grandfather. I used to always watch the weather. I was always fascinated with snows because as a typical kid, snows meant that you were going to get out of school if it came. And I was overseas, so we didn't get to see the snow. I was in Germany. You might get snow once a year because you're on the northern part along the coast, and I was in Japan. So I really watched that snow. But I got interested from my grandfather. He was a commercial fisherman, and he never had a college education. He never had a high school education. But he had to watch the weather as part of his living. And he was able, I would go out on the boats with him to watch him lift nets. He was able to look at at the Great Lakes, look at the way the waves were moving, looking at the clouds, being able to determine what the weather was going to be just by looking at Mother Nature. And that would direct him to where he needed to move his nets to, because the fish would respond to the currents and the temperatures in the water. That's where I got my interest in the field of meteorology. So I recognize that Mother Nature has an innate ability to determine whether or not we're going to break spring, and this is a typical year. I watch when the robins return, when the geese return. All of those things is a precursor to the spring because they have an innate ability to know when it's time to get up and go, so to speak. Robins showed up here in Lincoln at the end of January, and they haven't left. The snow geese finally came in. All of these things are pointing a month ahead of last year at this time, where we started to see these migrations. We're a full month ahead. So the last thing I'm looking for is a confirmation of the sandhill range to come in. If we get this weather coming in as expected here from the 20th on, I suspect we're going to see them come in the last full week of February. So we're off to a roaring start getting to the spring. Now, how long they remain here remains an open-ended question, but certainly we are definitely looking, as far as I'm concerned, to a much warmer spring period than we've had in the past. It doesn't mean it's not going to be wet and it's not going to be cool and damp, but compared to last spring, it does look to me to be a much warmer pattern developing. Right now, the current storm track favors for the wettest portion of Nebraska, eastern portion of the state. And we kind of seen that with the merger of those two jet streams. Everything seems to be forming in eastern Texas. Anything moisture is lifted up to the north is impacting more eastern Nebraska and points off to the east. Western Nebraska has been left high and dry on most of these. Their snow totals that I showed you there, the vast majority of that is all associated with 3 systems. We haven't had a major system since right past Christmas for western Nebraska. Unless we see a return of that here in the next 40 days, we're going to probably have to put a drought release out at some point as we go into the spring period, particularly because of southwestern Nebraska. We are going through these 6 to 8 week patterns. So we are due for a pattern change sometime in the next 3 weeks. It looks like the models are hinting at that already with the southwest low starting to try to form. And again, most of the moisture remain to the east and north of us compared to last winter. With a lower count of southern stream storms impacting us directly, there's still quite a few southern stream storms, but they're all moving to the south of us. Intraneutral conditions, I didn't update this. Consensus of the model said intraneutral through 2020, cooling, when I say intraneutral, it has to get to a half a degree. Their models were saying it's not going to get to a half degree by the end of the year, but there's cooling favor in the second half. The update over the last 24 hours says we're going to see La Nina conditions by this fall with a changeover into the cooler area as we get the early part of the summer. I fully expect that if this pattern continues, next month's release, we'll see that pushed up even further. And if, like I said, if we start to go into La Nina characteristics, meaning that the sea surface temperature for the basin get down to that half degree Celsius, it won't be classified as La Nina because you got to have 5 consecutive 3-month periods of that. But if we meet that criteria, then most likely we're going to see drought development across the southern plains, and most likely that will expand northward. So the second half of the growing season looks to be a much drier pattern under this scenario. Means that we'll probably see a lot more irrigation this year than we did last year, but also the crop that will most be directly impacted if we have a second half will be the soybean crop. If this thing starts to act together earlier, then of course dryland is going to suffer also on top of it. And I could see the scenario where Iowa and Illinois, just like last year, get a ton of rainfall. They get their crops in. We have a saturated condition where we have poor root development down deep into the profile because everything's being supplied to the surface, and then we turn hot and dry the second half of the summer. Those type of flash droughts are real critical for them. The vast majority of their droughts are that type of a drought, and that's when they get hurt the worst on yields. So there's that scenario, and the flip side is if it turns dry and you get a few timely rain events, you go completely the opposite way. So it's a lot easier to forecast sometimes yields in Nebraska than it is to the points to the east of them, especially under wet conditions, and that's exactly what we're facing. So there's a lot of uncertainty going forward. That being said, and I'll wrap this up, I'm almost there. The southern hemisphere during La Nina events tends to do very well in terms of yields. So you have to take that into consideration, and that would be this up. You're starting to see the tail of that starting to occur now, but more importantly for the 2021 growing season in the southern hemisphere, La Ninas tend to do very well. The one area that tends to do poorly under La Nina is Argentina, but Brazil, South Africa, and Australia all do very well during La Nina. And if you paid attention to all the fires that went on in Australia, what you will notice is that you're not hearing much about that anymore. The rains finally returned right after all of the press on this, and this is also when we're starting to see other areas of the globe respond similarly that they would under La Nina-like conditions. So the rains are returning, and the most likely scenario is that we're getting our confirmation by these early rain events that the events are starting to work basically more toward a La Nina type pattern, which is favorable for the southern hemisphere, is less favorable for the western corn belt in North America. Any questions? Yes, sir.
I've read somewhere where our growing season has lengthened by 15 to 20 days over the last 30 or so years. Do you agree with that? And if you do, do you think that's going to continue?
Okay. Yes, I'm going to try and repeat that. The question asked by the audience was, is read that the growing season extended anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks, and do we think that trend's going to continue? Yes, it has. In fact, we confirmed that with our mesonet. Whether it increases or not remains an open question. I think where we may have some issues is if we go into a much colder pattern. We could see that coming forward or shortening in a given year. I'm not convinced yet about length. If you look at it in a climatological standpoint, you would think at some point that growing season would reach a point where it can't extend any farther. I don't know. But all of our short and long-term indicators are showing, especially in the fall, a much warmer trend in the fall, particularly the month of September. That's pushing out those later freezes. It's the spring period where we had seen a lot of the warming, and the shorter term trends are a little bit cooler. So we may be starting to see an extension of the late freezes in the spring a little bit farther in the most recent 10 years, but not overall. And I am not going to use 10 years as a proxy for what is coming. But temporarily we're in this phase where it's been a little bit colder in the spring. And most of that's been since 2013 and beyond. Perhaps it's the year that we go the other way and start to dry up. So I wouldn't get all worked up about a short-term trend. If it lasts another 10 years, yeah, we might start to see something's really going on here. But we're going to need to see some confirmation. But at this point in time, we're definitely increasing our growing season. The thing that we have to be more consciously aware of is the extremes are not changing. The distribution pattern is not changing. So you're still seeing those late freezes. That puts you actually at more risk. Because if your growing season is increasing in length, the tendency is we're getting warmer in the early part of April. We tend to push that planting a little bit earlier and a little bit earlier. And that basically sets us up for a higher and higher risk, especially if you start to see more of those late freeze events. And I think that until that bites us, that trend will probably continue. And I can guarantee you that if we would have had the right conditions, everybody and their brother would have been out on the first day they could get planting because they're covered with crop insurance. I'm not, and I don't want to diverge too much here, but one of the things that concerns me more about when I first came here, we didn't see much activity in planting across this state until we got into the third full week of April, and now we've moved that up. I really don't believe that we should have moved the planting date up in this part of the country to the 10th of April. It's just assuming too much risk. Yes, the growing season has expanded, but you really it's counterproductive to crop insurance if you're looking at the payouts to do that. You're assuming a lot more risk that way. And most likely it's going to come back to haunt you, and you have to cover that at some point in time. So it's going to boil down to if it happens 3 or 4 times, they'll change the policies and start pushing the date back so they don't have to pay out as much. That's when you'll start to see that the spring is not expanding, it's starting to contract. But I haven't seen it yet, and statistically 4 or 5 years in a scheme of the long-term and short-term trends means nothing at this point in time. Any other questions? Well, yes, sir.
You mentioned Mother Nature. Well, I saw a flock of great language that was 20 cranes.
They are. The comment for those that are for taping was that about the wildlife, you're seeing the geese. I seen mine last night, was the first ones I seen, big flocks. And I didn't see no cranes a couple days ago, but I don't doubt that. I was looking for them, but they, those first scouts come in, if you're in the right spot, you see them. But usually, if those first ones show up, it's within 7 to 10 days that the main drive comes in. So I think I don't know how they do it. If we could figure that out, we'd all be greater forecasters. But they have an innate ability to be able to figure that out. That's called evolution. And so if we could ever figure that out, we might all be better forecasters and know when to put our crops in at a much less risk, let's just put it that way. Thank you very much. Been a pleasure.
Hey, thanks, Al. I had to give a similar talk on Monday, so I'm glad you. Hopefully, you're right because I said the same thing. So,
Oh, that's
we're
not-
on the same page.
That's not good. No. Two meteorologists agree you better run for the hills.
Go grab a coat, right? Okay, well, thanks, Al. Appreciate it. Next up, we'll have Amelia Brynig come up, and she's the Assistant Director at Nebraska Department of Ag. You've been there a couple years? 2 years? Just one? A year and a couple months. Well, she's right. I bet it did. Yeah. So it's good to have her here. She took over, like I said, a little over a year ago as assistant director. You can do that, or you can do this, whatever you prefer. And so I just invite her down to just share a little bit about kind of what's going on in the department, some of the latest happenings, and there's always lots to talk about, I'm sure. And so they may even have a few questions for you. So I'll let them fire away.
Good morning, everyone. As Tyler said, my name is Amelia. Thank you. And I'm the Deputy Director for the Nebraska Department of Agriculture. We do have a lot going on at the department, but lucky for you, Tyler told me I only had about 10 minutes. So you won't have to put up with me for too awful long. But I want to start with giving you kind of a brief little snapshot and update of what we saw with dicamba this past year here in the state of Nebraska. Talk a little bit about where we are right now with our newly minted hemp program at the department and for the state, and then I'll wrap up with some international trade. So as far as dicamba goes, as many or all of you know, this was the third year in which the product was really utilized here in the state of Nebraska. And as has happened in the previous 2 years, about that late July, August, September timeline, the communication with our pesticide crew at the department really kind of took an uptick in just terms of folks calling in, and whether it was formalized complaints or just having questions or wanting to report things. We had very much of that at that time. We had a lot of questions and a lot of interest from people and representatives of the Nebraska legislature this year, actually, which kind of had a new little twist on it in terms of the interested parties that we've dealt with before. Most of over the course of the last 2 years, who we've heard from have been farmers, ranchers, and folks in the ag industry. And so when we had a couple of senators, primarily in the southeastern corner of the state, take some interest in that added a unique little twist. A question that we got time and time again kind of throughout this process was, are we seeing an uptick this past year versus previous years? And while I can't get into specifics on numbers with you guys, what I can tell you is that over the course of the past 3 years, the number of complaints and then numbers of actually confirmed cases have been pretty standard streamline. It's been pretty even average over the course of the last 3 years. And of course, as many of you all are familiar with the product, as it pertains to us in the state of Nebraska, we're trying to enforce a label that has been put upon to us by the EPA. And oftentimes when it comes time to disseminate an actual dicamba complaint, it can be very difficult to actually chart back where some of the mishandling or maybe some of the application errors may have occurred. So it is rather difficult when we do get a formal complaint. Our process is to ask for pictures, ask for personal accounts, and try to build a case, but oftentimes we have the unfortunate task of trying to prove something that can be very difficult to prove. When the EPA met in December, I believe it was, in Salt Lake City, Nebraska is a member of the Region 7, so we had a Region 7 and 8 meeting with the EPA and other member states this past December. Talked a lot about what other states were doing in terms of actively trying to put a cutoff date in. North Dakota, Iowa has tried to do this. You have to apply by X day or you're unable to apply. And just talking through other options that other states have kind of looked at doing, and also getting feedback from the EPA on, what are you guys hearing? What are your thoughts on what we can do? And I'll be completely honest with you, states that have tried to be a little bit more active in putting in stipulations in terms of application timelines and things of that nature really didn't report any different of a result, any better of a result, and we didn't get much more positive feedback from the EPA in terms of them putting forth any label changes this next year or anytime soon. So it's something that we continue to monitor and think about how we can better tackle some of these complaints and these issues. And now we have very much welcomed interest from our Nebraska legislature, which has opened up a whole new dialogue for us that we've been able to kind of explore. And I would very much assume that these conversations will be ongoing, and it'll be something that we continue to monitor into 2020, and then of course in late July and then August of 2020 when things probably start to ramp up again. Being conscious of time, I want to shift rather quickly to the hemp program that we've just recently started within the Nebraska Department of Agriculture. Last year, during the 2019 legislative session, a bill was passed directing the Department of Agriculture to provide a regulatory framework and program for industrial hemp growth in the state of Nebraska. So we submitted a plan. The USDA needed to provide all states with a finalized rule, which they did in October. It was actually Halloween, October 31st, which then sort of started a clock for states to submit their own state plan that would then need to be approved by USDA. The state of Nebraska submitted our plan to the USDA roughly mid-December, and then we heard back, I believe it was 2 weeks ago now, that we were approved and ready to get going. And so as of Wednesday, I believe, of last week, my dates are running in for me, I apologize for that, but Wednesday of last week, we started accepting applications, grower applications, processor applications for the growth season for 2020 and as well as moving forward. So those will be on an annual basis. If you are approved to get a license to grow hemp, it is an annual thing. There are fees associated with it. We have a lot of good information for anyone that's interested or just has questions on our website at nda.nebraska.gov. And we have, I think, as of yesterday, about 60 folks that have put in their application and applied to grow hemp in the state of Nebraska. And we do very much, with all of the interest surrounding this topic, we very much anticipate that number is going to grow. There is a bill in the legislature right now that it's LB 1152 for any of you avid legislative trackers. LB 1152 basically is a cleanup bill put forward by the Department of Agriculture, the Attorney General's office. The state troopers also worked with us to kind of help harmonize a couple things that, in the 2019 growing season, when we were basically disseminating licensing agreements on more of a learning basis or more of a trial and error basis, things that we learned when the USDA provided their final rule to us in October, that we had written the law trying to, enable our farmers and ranchers to get out there and grow, but that we kind of did things not knowing where things were going to fall on the federal level. And so now that we do, there's just that general harmonization that needs to occur from the state and federal level. So I believe that bill was heard by the Ag Committee 2 weeks ago, and I believe it still is in the Ag Committee, but we do expect that it's going to process out of the Ag Committee and then will be considered at some point this legislative session by the full legislature. And then finally, the last thing I just wanted to touch on, we continue to be very active on the international trade front, a priority of Governor Ricketts and definitely a priority for my boss, Director Steve Wellman. I'm actually leaving tomorrow from Lincoln bright and early at 6 a.m. to head to Seoul, Korea, and then on to Tokyo, Japan with Lieutenant Governor Foley, who's leading a trade mission there. So focusing on in South Korea, they've been a wonderful customer for us. In fact, they're our number 3 export market for ag products. So focusing on the gambit, all of our commodities, pork, beef, and then very, very similar touches in Japan with the newly minted deal that was signed, phase 1 with Japan and the United States earlier this year. We view it as a very good opportunity for Nebraska to head back there and thank customers that have been good customers for us for a long time, and then hopefully find a little bit more business and a few more prospective customers. And then coming up on the international trade front for 2020, the governor has identified 2 different trade missions that he will be leading and conducting. The first will be to the United Kingdom and Israel. That will occur in June, focused more on ag tech companies and particularly in the UK, just with them leaving the EU and with Brexit going on, lots of opportunities in ag tech and in our agriculture commodity space to be had there. And then Israel is, of course, a huge importer of beef and kosher beef, but Nebraska actually is the only state in the United States that exports beef to Israel for the United States. Kind of an interesting and neat fact there for us. And then the second trade mission that Governor Ricketts will conduct will be likely in August back to South Korea and the Philippines. And that mission will again be led by the governor, but that will be focused a little bit more on the Department of Agriculture, our priorities in terms of selling and exporting commodities. And again, proteins, beef, pork, and poultry and things of that nature. That was a lot in 10 minutes, but I'm more than happy to answer any questions about anything that you might have. And then Tyler, of course, has my information. I have some business cards, so if there's ever any follow-up questions or anything you would need from the Department of Agriculture, we would be more than happy to be helpful how we can be. Yes, sir. Very good question. So the question was, in terms of folks that are applied and approved to grow hemp in the state, is that going to be a self-certified process, or will we have inspectors that will go out and help test? There will be certified folks that will go out and help test. As I say, we're in the process right now of setting that up at the department, whether that will be folks on our staff or whether it's something that we contract out. That still is in the process of getting set up and decided, but it will need to be someone certified to go out and take those samples. Thank you. We appreciate that. We feel very fortunate to have Israel's business in that regard. Yes, ma'am. The question, thank you for that. The question was, who are the hemp processors in Nebraska and where are they? And the answer is there are none currently. The closest processing facilities for the state of Nebraska are in Colorado or in North Dakota. Follow-up question, what are they going to do with their crop? Very good question, and one in which I think multiple folks have been trying to kind of come up with a good answer to be completely honest with you. And that's one thing I get a question a lot of, what are your thoughts on farmers and ranchers that want to get into growing hemp, on the viability and the ability to make sales and actually make a profit? And my answer would be this, and it's based on things that I've learned from other states. Definitely know what you're getting into before you go and you kind of put all your eggs in that basket. We very much do believe at the Department of Agriculture that this could be a wonderful new crop and commodity for the state of Nebraska. But with any crop and commodity that you're just learning to grow, there are a lot of intricate things that you need to think about when you get into it and on the onset. For example, even just finding seed suppliers, finding seeds that are not going to test hot. It's a very volatile crop, and so our response is number one, know kind of what you're getting into, what you're hoping to accomplish, but two, have an end use for that crop that you're growing. And so whether it's you're contacting with processors in the state of Colorado or North Dakota or wherever, have a place for your product to go before you basically put it in the ground. When I was at that aforementioned EPA meeting in December, I sat next to the gal from Montana, and they, of course, had a hemp program a little bit started earlier than us in 2014, and they were doing a lot more on the research part side of it than the state of Nebraska was. And so I just asked her, how is that going? And in 2019, all of the growers, or 90% I think it was, of the growers in the state of Montana had contracted with one facility or one end use space for all of their hemp, that the company then went bankrupt, and all of these people were unable to make good on their contracts, and so hemp was basically stockpiled in the state of Montana. So my only response to that would be, as it pertains to us, if hemp is stockpiled in other states and they're also vying to send to processors in Colorado or North Dakota or wherever. That's something that our farmers and ranchers need to be aware of if they hope to grow it. So the question was, is there going to be any sort of a no spray zone as there are for folks who grow other specialty like crops like grapes or other things of that nature? Again, good question. The EPA has put out a few guidelines in regards to hemp that we're taking a look at internally at the department and still trying to understand where we fit into that in terms of enforcing it and whatnot. And so I know they're trying to look at that. And that's the thing about hemp. A lot of this you just don't really know. The crop, you know, we joke about it, about how, and I'm from Arapahoe, Nebraska. My dad still farms there. I'm sixth generation. How, you know, this is the strongest ditchweed that we've ever come across, and you can't kill it. It can't die. But suddenly, when you want to start growing it for commercial purposes, it becomes very volatile, and it really doesn't take a lot to damage the crop and to you know damage your outlook at profits. So, good question. Anything else? Yes, ma'am. So the question was, with all the research and everything being done, is anyone looking at starting up a pipeline or starting a cooperative in terms of a processor? I think those conversations are ongoing. The bill, LB 657, that called for the program that was passed last year, it also calls for a development of a hemp commission that will not go into effect until September 1st of 2020, just for funding purposes and the way things work in the legislature. That's just how it kind of happened out. You know, when we disseminated 10 licensing agreements this past year for 2019, a couple of those were processor agreements. But you know, as you know, that takes 3 to 4 years, or I mean, to actually build the facility, get it up and running. So I know people that are active, you know, in the industry here. Annette Wiles is very active in looking at different opportunities. I know they've been having those conversations, but outside of that, I don't know. There's nothing that the Department of Agriculture is looking at in terms of facilitating a co-op, because our priority right now is to try to just get our program up and running, and that's what the legislature has directed us to do. Thank you guys very much. It was a pleasure to be with you this morning.
Okay, thanks, Amelia. Appreciate that. We'll go ahead and take a break now. If you haven't been here, the restrooms are just around the corner. And also, Larry, the president of the Lancaster County Farm Bureau, put out some membership forms back there if you want to join the Lancaster County Farm Bureau, though. So never miss an opportunity, Larry. Good job. Feel free to grab some snacks, visit for a little bit. We'll be back here at probably just shy of 10:30, and we'll get started back up with Doug Simon. So thanks. gathering back in and gather to our chairs, and we'll get started with the next speaker. I'm a minute later than I had planned. If you push and hold, it'll turn on.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go ahead and start with our next session here. We're happy to have Doug Simon from Tredas. You've probably seen him on a Market Journal or maybe even do business with him. He's does a lot of this stuff and a lot of these things. So we knew we wanted to talk about markets, and so I don't know if there's a better person to bring in that's just totally immersed in markets almost every day, all day, because it probably changes as fast as the weather does. So it's
More so.
more so than the weather.
More so than the weather.
Hopefully you're more right than a meteorologist. So that's what we like to do. I have to pin myself down. So.
The Lord created meteorologists to make commodity brokers look good. So, yeah. So, sorry about
Right.
that.
Well, yeah. I'll just leave it at that. We'll go.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks.
That's my one joke for the day.
Yeah,
But yeah,
well-
I'm sorry to pin that on you and Al, but actually I look and follow these guys pretty closely because weather does have big impact on what we're doing, obviously, in Nebraska. And our range, Tredas, our group works in Nebraska. Our company's based here in Lincoln. We've got offices up in Lindsay and up in, we've got Adam Mickus and our groups from O'Neill. So we've got a lot of people that are up kind of in the northern part of the state. And we've got an office down in Nebraska City. We have one person that works down in Alabama. And so he kind of keeps us in touch with what's going down there. But we met him, trading with him through Gavilan and Fremont and over in southwest Iowa, excuse me. So, but our group, Tredas, was started working with farmers. All of us had some type of commercial grain experience. Personally worked in the food industry, also worked in food exporting, but also in beef exporting, done some of that type of work. So my background, I've had commodity experience for probably 30 years. The last 20 has been working specifically with farmers and helping market their grains and trying to help them focus on what they love to do. Marketing is probably, I think, one of the most difficult things that you do because there's a lot of unpredictability and uncertainty, largely based on the weather. But our goal is to try to impose some discipline in terms of that marketing process. And a lot of the things that I learned, I went to the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. I graduated from there in the late in the 80s. My wife went to university. My 3 kids, my youngest one just graduated from UNL last year. So we've got a long history with UNL, but a lot of my experience, my initial love for commodities started with Jim Kendrick in ag marketing class. And I see some people shaking their heads positively and some crossing, yeah, the pipe. And so yeah, Jim was he was a mentor. I worked in the Department of Ag Econ, worked in the Ag Marketing Center for a little bit, and then also worked on my master's degree there. And then taught Ag Econ 141. But Jim was a mentor. I know when I sat in his class, he was always kind of an enigma, and he was always, I never did quite figure the guy out. But as I got to know him more, I really enjoyed, because he gave me a lot of perspective about business that was useful, and I learned a tremendous amount about grain marketing. And our name Tredas, it's really a combination of Drew and Adam and Simon or Doug. We kind of came up with something to be a little bit different, but Trey is really about futures basis carry. Where did I learn about that? That was in Jim Kendrick's class. And Jim was adamant about looking at those 3 things. And a lot of the marketing stuff that we do is based on futures, basis, carry. It's simple stuff, as Jim would say, but you got to do it day in and day out. And so our whole concept of what we do is based on that idea, but it's also based on a lot of work that they've done over at Iowa State University and University of Illinois. There's a lot of discipline behind the marketing process rather than trying to predict. It's really difficult to predict what markets are going to do day in and day out because of the weather, because of a lot of international factors, which have really hit the markets, more so in the last 10 to 20 years. So what I want to talk about a little bit is about how we think about the market, because I think that is kind of immutable or unchangeable, where the weather's going to change every day. How are you going to deal with the uncertainty in the markets? So from our perspective, the futures market is unpredictable, but basis and carry are definable and predictable. So how do you deal with that uncertainty in the futures market is kind of what I want to talk about today. And then hopefully I've kept this talk short enough. Maybe we talk a little bit about some of the cash markets and the things that are kind of impacting Nebraska. Because, like I said, we don't go all over the country and working with the farmers that we work with. We focus on this area, so we really are active with our farmers that we work with and helping them merchandise their corn and soybeans, a little bit of wheat and livestock in these markets. So, everybody's always asking me where the market's going to go. I didn't want to really talk about the markets today, so I wanted to talk about horse racing. They're building a horse racing track out here. Is that really what I want to do? Not really, but one of the concepts I want you to think about, and I'm going to talk about it here more in depth just shortly, is, which horse are you going to bet on? Are you going to bet on the horse in the orange or the red or the yellow? Which one are you going to pick there? I mean, from this point in the race, you're probably going to pick this one here that's in the green and the yellow with the orange saddle or the orange saddle blanket. Is that the one you're going to pick? So at the beginning of the year, you're trying to decide, okay, if they're all just going to come out of the gate, which marketing year, how is it going to act? If you look back at last year, would you have bet that we were going to have those kind of wet conditions all the way through and have like the most difficult planting season ever? Trying to predict that thing prior to the growing year is a really difficult thing to do. So what I want to talk about is another concept, and this is one of the best books that I've read in a while. It's by Annie Duke. She's a poker player, and she talks about the idea of thinking in bets and making smarter decisions when you don't have all the facts, she didn't talk about corn marketing in her book, but there's a lot of ideas that you can garner, kind of pull out of this book about how do you think about marketing, I believe. Most of the time, people are going to look at a horse and put all their money on that one horse. Or they're going to think about, I think this concept here, what that Andy talks about is important, where you're going to look at that decision process over time and what's the likelihood of an occurrence. The other thing I like about her book is she talks about chess and she talks about poker and how they're different. And I think they have a lot of applicability to the marketing decisions of corn marketing as well. She talks about the game of poker and the game of chance and how cards come up and it's a dynamic game, and compare that to chess. Chess is a game that it's very structured and organized. If you got a chess kind of expert that's out there, they're going to beat me 100 times to 1 in that game because it's very ordered and you make decisions based on a very ordered system. But the game of poker, you don't know what next card's going to pop up. And I think corn marketing's like that, which makes our job pretty difficult. But if you want to read a book, I think this is an excellent book to kind of help you frame you kind of put together a mindset. Now, this is, in your book there's two pages that you need to look at. And this is the one that you need to hang on to. I think it's on page 3. But this is one, if you want to put something underneath your pillow, it's something we live and die by. And it's a seasonal pattern from a group called More Research out of Oregon. And it's based on some of the same concepts that Roy or Roy Smith over in Plattsmouth, kind of where I grew up in Cass County, some of the things that he talks about. But looking at seasonal patterns for corn, and this stuff isn't new. Bob Wisner over at Iowa State University, who was also here at the University of Nebraska when I was in grad school, was one of my mentors. He talked a lot about these seasonal patterns, and he's done a lot of real practical work. Unfortunately, he's retired now. He worked in their Ag Ethanol Center for a while. But basically what this argues is when you look at a corn price over a span of January through December, and you put those corn prices on indexes 0 to 100, Roy Smith, he always averages them together. So I think it's nice to put them on an actual index instead of just the cash price and look at these futures prices. But basically argues is that you need to be looking at selling your corn ahead of time before you raise it. So trying to look ahead when there's still uncertainty in the market and when there's also premium in the market, because you go through a growing year, as we get to know more about what the weather's going to be, we basically tend to erode prices. And when you look at this in terms of likelihood of how often this is going to happen, this happens about 75% of the time, where you start out higher in the spring and you run lower into the fall. There's about 25% of the time where you start out lower in the springtime and run higher into the fall. And it tends to be in years like 2012 when we had a drought, or in other years where we've had other drought issues. But 25% of the time we'll tend to run higher. But so one of the horses that I want to bet on is this one here. If that's going to happen more often, I want to look at focusing my sales in a favorable time frame or a seasonal type strategy and do something not in one big fell swoop, and don't sell all your corn here because you don't know exactly what's going to happen through the year. But you want to look at trying to hit maybe some strength in those time frames in the springtime, because this stuff is also in concert with some of the work that, when you look at the stuff they've done at Iowa State University and Kansas State University and University of Illinois, because the crop insurance time frame that they look at in terms of the pricing periods are here during February. There's a reason why they break up your multi-peril crop insurance into two different periods. There's a February price, and there's an October price. But the actuarials have looked at this stuff too. Universities have looked at this. This stuff is not new. It's not something that's not, kind of earth-shattering that, showing that. But one of the things that we do that's kind of a little bit different from the University of Illinois basically said, okay, what happens if we look at selling in this time frame on a daily basis? Does that outperform marketing advisors? And that's actually what they found out, that if you could sell a little bit every day in this time frame, that actually outperformed all the different the advisors that are out there. But the problem is for a farmer to implement that, that's pretty difficult, because if you're big enough, I mean, you can sell 1,000 bushels maybe every day or 5,000 bushels every day, but I don't know any farmer that can do that. And so one of the ideas that we look at is just selling within a month time frame, but trying to find strength within that month. So essentially, if you've got 100,000 bushels to sell and you've got 70% crop insurance guarantee, you basically got 10,000 bushel increments that you could kind of sell, maybe some in January, some in Feb, March, April, May, June, and look at that, where you can try to hit that strength within a time frame. But that's kind of a goal that you want to be able to look at in terms of trying to sell corn ahead of time. Unfortunately, the hard thing for a farmer, though, is the best futures price comes in this time of frame. When's the best basis tend to happen? Mr. Barkley, sitting here in the front row, when's your best basis show up? Sorry to ask you a question. Yeah, move to the back. So anyway, the best basis tends to happen after you raise your crop. Your best futures is here, but your best basis is later, so it's a difficult situation. That works great for a cattle feeder, because they can buy all their corn here at harvest after we raise it, and when the basis levels are wide, and they also have an opportunity to go out and buy into a lower time frame. But the farmer has an exact opposite problem of that. Your best futures come out here most of the time, but your best basis levels, because once we get past gut slot harvest, it tends to improve. So a good marketing plan, you have to segregate those two things. You have to decouple them I think, to become a good marketer. And then the other thing that you deal with is that carry that's out there after you raise the crop as well. So I think to do a good marketing plan, you have to decouple those decisions. Now, looking back over history, how does it work to sell in that seasonal period from February 15th to June 15th that's defined by the guys over at the University of Illinois? How does that perform versus selling at the harvest time frame? If you look from 1980 to 2003, if you looked at that seasonal price, it was $2.62 versus $2.47. It was about a 15-cent advantage. From 80 to 2019, there was about a 20-cent advantage. Doing 2004 to 2019, there was about a 27-cent advantage. And here, in these more recently, kind of bearish patterns that we've had since 2012, it was about a 66-cent advantage. It's about a $4.31 average price if you sold every day in the spring versus that fall price that we had in September 15th to October 15th. Now, the last 5 years, that price has dropped down to about a 33-cent advantage because we've been more in this $4 kind of range for a seasonal average, everyday price on futures between February 15th and June 15th. So that advantage versus that harvest average has gone down. It's not as much as it had been where we were coming off that higher price plateau. The other idea that they look at is, what if you would sell the year before you actually raise the crop? Starting basically in like September. So if you're talking about a seasonal average, if we're getting ready to plant this crop, you would have started marketing your crop last September, and we're into February. And you'd have another, toward harvest, you'd look at that on a yearly, what they call a yearly period of selling. That average was not quite as strong as doing it, compressed it in that February through June time frame, but almost about the same. So our focus is, okay, let's focus most of our sales in that February through June time frame. But in the event that we do run into a year like 2012 where the market prices jump up, or 2009, we'll go ahead and move more toward a yearly type deal where we'll sell ahead of time. I'll talk about that here in a few minutes. You have any questions at this point? We can take a little break about this concept that's, I think, really underpins. It gives you a mindset or kind of a thought process in terms of how I want to deal with futures year in, year out. Is there a benchmark or something I can follow? And this is kind of the thing that we look at. All right, we'll keep moving along here. So one thing I want to do is, okay, look back, let's think about what happened last year. And this is where we were last February, in this time frame right here. We were running basically all the way back toward harvest, kind of in that $4 range. And one of the things that I've thrown up on here is some moving averages to look at. That purple line's a 50-day moving average. That's supposed to be more of an orangish one. Is that the line here, and the green one is a 200-day moving average. And one of the things, weather, if you look at commodity markets, I think they tend to revert back to a mean. You might have some deviation from that and volatility, but there's a lot of times where we tend to kind of move back toward that average price. But one of the things we like to look at is that 200-day moving average, and where are we sitting relative to that? But last year there was a pretty tight confluence of those prices. There's some different moves in there, but when you look at a 392 to 406 range in terms of commodities, that was pretty tight. When you look at that price in the springtime, being toward $4, which ended up being the February crop insurance price and ended up being that average price between February 15th and June 15th. Going into that time frame, it's like, okay, that's probably going to be a benchmark that we're going to have to market around into the marketing year. The same time last year, though, one of the things that was showing up, something similar to this. I wish Al was here to kind of comment about this a little bit, but right now, like South American weather, we were in kind of a similar boat last year where there was some dryness showing up in kind of central Brazil, big growing area, in that part of the country. A little bit, down in here into Argentina, which we've seen. Now we've caught some rains here recently and kind of helped them out a little bit. We had some uncertainty about their weather, at that time last year. And right now, even though these anomalies, it's being a little bit drier than normal down there, they're actually, moving ahead pretty well with their soybean crop harvest, and they're starting to work on planting their second crop. So where we were, here last year, we're kind of having some of those same concerns. So the weather is always going to be impacting these markets, and sometimes we kind of shut that stuff out of our thought process because we have to kind of focus on, I think, following that seasonal pattern that we look at, because that gives us more insight than day-to-day weather does. So where did we go as we rolled into the spring, kind of what was happening? I think one of the tendencies last year after we came out of that kind of February time frame, we had a lot of big bars in there in that chart. And a lot of that was based on stuff that was going on with the trade deal, in terms of talking about what was going on with China. Some of those days in there, we also had stocks report there at the end of the month, at the end of the quarter, where they were looking at acres and stocks, and those stocks came in at 300 million bushels above the guess. We had pretty good sizable acres, and we had a pretty big fall off. So we had a pretty big departure from that 200-day moving average, 50, 100-day, and we got a lot of negativity pretty early in the market last year, which was pretty frustrating. It'd been nice to see this thing kind of work back more up above $4 in the spring as we had some uncertainty. But we weren't really even into the weather markets at that point. So one of the other guideposts we like to look at is how bullish or how bearish are people when they're looking at markets. And going into the spring last year, the markets were pretty positive right around Christmas time, and we basically had a lot of negativity kind of entering into the market as we went into that May time frame, where the funds were negative and they were starting to push the markets down. And so if you look at that bullish indicator there, as the things got more negative, you can kind of see where we went, late into the spring, and we had that big spike down. But you look at those deviations that we had there was a lot of negativity in the market. And so sometimes markets, we can look at weather and talk about a lot of things, but a lot of times we like to look at how other people are thinking and what those waves of optimism or pessimism are in the market. And you can kind of see where we bottom out there in that amount of pessimism. But then where did we go during the summer? And you can kind of see as we rolled ahead, we went from that kind of extreme negativity, and as the wet conditions persisted across the Corn Belt, everybody kind of flipped from being really negative and really to a point where the emotion was so bullish, not only from the traders out there as well, market higher. It was probably, to me, one of the most emotional years ever in terms of marketing because of if we go into more of a drier period, we have more experience with that. But we've only had one other instance in 1993 where we kind of started going into a really difficult flooding situation, not only in Nebraska. I mean, that happened back in March 15th, but as the wetness persisted and the planting delayed, where that uncertainty really blew up and mounted. But the thing that was unique last year is that market really broke before we resolved a lot of that uncertainty. And that's the way commodity markets are. A lot of times they'll put a lot of bullishness in there or a lot of negativity in there ahead of it and do things that we don't really anticipate, or they'll do it before you think it should do it. And that's where those ebbs and flows of money going into the markets can tend to push them beyond what you may think they should do going down low, but also on the high side. So to me, this last year was one of the more difficult marketing years because we were selling corn between February, into June 15th, but as we got out into this time frame, we probably had 70% of our insurance guarantees sold. So when we got ready to go into this time frame, we had a couple bullets left, but it was very emotional as we got into here because we didn't know what we were going to plant, what was going to get planted, and where this crop was going to end up. So just going through the kind of as we broke here in June, we had one rebound and then boom, it was pretty much all the way back down here into the 350s. And we did revert to that mean and then we blew out to the bottom side of that. But that was a very volatile year. But it kind of followed that seasonal pattern where it was higher in the spring, kind of ran lower early, but then it blew up and then it kind of came back. So in reality, that was still kind of a bearish pattern, kind of similar to the 3 out of the 4 years that we tend to see, that kind of bearish pattern. So there was a lot of uncertainty, but it eventually kind of came back to those moving averages in this time frame. So there's again some big gaps in there as well, but the volatility last year was pretty tremendous. Now, what are we going to do about it? Trying to predict that stuff ahead of time is difficult, and it's easy to look back at it. But let's look at some different things here. So one thing, again, the bullish sentiment that I showed you there a few minutes ago, here you can see where those funds that are out there in the market, the commodity funds, there's this aggregated fund position. Basically, there's people that are out there that are doing, there's an index fund, but there's also funds that are just managed money that are speculating in the markets. And if you look at these, there's a lot of, I think, similarity between price movements and what these people are doing. So when they get to be pretty bearish and push prices a low, futures prices tend to go down to a low. When they get to be pretty bullish and start running markets up to a high, that's when the markets tend to run up to their high. So that's not a predictive indicator. It's a lagging indicator, but what it tells you is that when everybody else is getting pretty dang bearish, maybe it's not time to be getting bearish. But when everybody gets bullish, it's probably a time to be laying off risk and be selling some. So when you look back at where we were last January and you look back in the previous springtime, prior to that, when those funds get to be long and they get to be pretty bullish, it's a good place to be selling. When they're that negative though, it's a time to be either, if you need to be buying some call options or something like that, or if you want to be holding off on making sales, I think that's a pretty good big picture indicator. So if you put that fund position again here, I kind of overlaid it with what the market was doing, but you can see there was a massive short there, about 300,000 contracts of corn. They didn't get nearly as long in the summer. That's what was kind of perplexing. If they got that short and not a lot of whole information in the springtime, why did they only get long, up toward 200,000 contracts? That was a little bit perplexing. You kind of thought maybe they're going to go up to 300,000 long or maybe 400,000 long and push that thing up toward 520, which is where kind of the monthly averages were. So the market kind of fell short of that. But I think a lot of that was because of what was going on in South America, where they had fairly decent sized crops, the amount of corn that we had in Ukraine. And so our world markets sometimes kind of keep these things in check. Beyond what we thought might happen here directly, the world markets are having a big impact. So if we can't predict what the market's going to do and we don't know what the future's going to do, sometimes as a commodity broker, we'll like to use options. But a lot of times people look at those things and they say, man, we're going to buy a 440 call. I'm talking about if I would have done something like last summer or last springtime, before we run into a big run up. And so some of the things we look at is, okay, trying to buy calls in a portfolio sense. If you're going to go out and sell your crop ahead of time in conjunction with your crop insurance, going out and buying calls ahead of the crop year. About this time right now, this year, for the crop that we're now starting to market, that we're going to actually plant in May and harvest next year. But one of the ideas from a portfolio standpoint is, okay, I'm going to keep selling futures over time, but maybe I want to buy 20% of my crop in calls ahead of time. The statement is, or the idea is, you want to buy your calls when you can, not when you have to. If you go out and you try to do this in the summer when the market's already blown up, it's impossible. But I just want to show you a few call prices to give you an idea of what you could do. The thing is, if you go buy a December 2020 call that's in the 440 strike today, they're about, now this is from back in January when we were doing our client meetings, they were about 14 cents, 14 and a half. The futures market was $4. Today it's more like $3.92. Volatility is about 19 cents. There was about 319 days expiration. They were 14 cents. Those are too expensive to buy, I think. So one of the ideas is, okay, what if I go to a September call that's got less time in it? It's only got 229 days. It's about 12 cents. If you would look in the option calculator and say if we made a run like we did last summer and went up toward 480, those calls would have gone from 12 cents to 54 cents. So another idea is, okay, what happens if I got out of those things a little bit sooner? That was out in June expiration. What if I waited till July and got out of there, but were worth about 47 cents? But still, I think that 14 to 12 cents is too expensive. So one of the ideas to look at is maybe buying a September 440 call that's, when we get out here, about 188 days toward expiration. So right now a month ago, we were 229 days away from expiration. So now we're about, we're about in that range. So these calls are, if you look at those now, we're kind of moving into that range where these things have come down in cost. If you wait a little bit and wait for volatility to go up as you go further into the spring, those calls are going to bump up a little bit. But from a portfolio approach, with a lot of the farmers that we work with that have, look and use futures and try to hedge over time, we'll look at these calls as a way to put into our portfolio in case we have a weather event next year. So shifting gears and kind of looking forward now, another thing we look at is what's the different price range we could see in a year. So if you look back at last year when we planted, anticipating, actually we were kind of thinking we would be planting around that 89 million acres actually, planted last year. Carryouts last year were kind of in that 2 billion, range, when we were talking about this stuff last February. If you roll into next year for this crop that we're going to plant, RJO, Ag Resource, a lot of the commercials are going to say that we're going to plant 94 to 96 million acres of corn. And if you go in and you look at percent harvested and you roll through a balance sheet, basically you're going to go with RJO's, with their expectations for acres, using exports at about 2.2 billion, which is up from last year, up from 2 years ago. Not as big as what it was after Brazil had that failure in their safrinha crop, and where we were able to pick up a lot of exports because of that, but having a little bit of a rebound on the export side of it. They've got carryout down at about 2.2 billion, which is growing from last year, but the carryout to use stocks are about 15.4. Now, if you look at numbers from Ag Resource, they're using 96 million acres, and they're not as optimistic that we're going to export that much. They've got carryouts ballooning up to 3.2 billion, which is a very, very negative price scenario. But even in the more optimistic scenario with the 2.2 billion bushel carryover, you're still going to go back, build carryout, and price lows next, fall would be projected somewhere in that 340 level. If you go into using the ARC outlook, Ag Resource Company out of Chicago, at 96 million acres, those price projections are down toward 305, pretty negative. And that's where Ag Resources numbers here, using less exports, higher acre numbers, have a pretty negative price outlook based on the rebound of corn acres. Not having the prevent plant that we had last year on the bean side of it or the corn side of it. So Al talked a lot bit about deviations, I think, in moisture conditions. Obviously, last year we were really wet. Other things kind of looking in the corn market right now, U.S. Gulf prices are the lowest feed grain in the world right now relative to feed wheat out of the Black Sea. We're kind of on par with Argentina right now, a little bit below the Black Sea. And then carry out that Brazilian number, but we've got a little time frame in here, a window where our exports should be pretty darn competitive and should be attractive also to China in case they do need to import some corn into South China to replenish their markets and not have to move corn from their north down into the south. So there's a possibility that they could do some things, just based on the price, not necessarily on the phase one trade deal. Net revenues right now, looking forward, I mean, we always like to look at these to see what we think the balance of acres are going to be, but when you look at net revenue on corn slightly exceeding the bean price, we had bean prices here toward $9.80, 2 months ago, and corn was at $4. This thing might have swung a little bit toward the beans at that time when people were kind of, they were locking in seed right before Christmas. This thing's going to remain in flux, but it's kind of hopeful that we might attract a few more bean acres and stay away from that 96 million acre number. But now with bean prices falling back off again, and that soybean to corn ratio is kind of falling back off again. Again, another one of those slides from Ag Resource on their planting intentions, 85 million on the beans and 96 on the corn. That's a really bearish number for the corn, obviously. It's maybe not quite as concerning for the beans, but it allows us to build stock or to keep our stocks in that 500 million bushel range. So again, big picture things out there on the corn. When you look at it, this is from RJO, that's at that 2.2 billion level. We don't even have room for the Ag Resource prediction up there of 3.2 billion. But those are pretty heavy corn stocks when you look at back in the history of stocks to use ratios in terms of how much is out there in the market. Not as heavy as what it was back in the 80s, but it goes back to the periods that we saw, prior to the drought and prior to the big run up in commodity prices back in 2007, 8, and 9. So where do we stand right now on corn prices? This is with corn price being down here at 380, that's the March 2020 contract. So from a cash grain marketing standpoint, after the big run up in summer, we did kind of have that fallout, and then we did have a rebound back up to that 200-day moving average, which was about 411 on futures. And we kind of hit that, and we ran into that, and we've been able to, we've retraced and fell back off of that. We've been able to recover a little bit. And the kind of hope was that we'd be able to get back into this 403 to kind of 395 range again to look at making some more sales. If we do that, we'd probably be looking out to May and July on the futures with the carry that's out there and being able to move corn, not necessarily, and we've been moving corn in this time frame because our basis levels have been pretty good, but to look at making the last increments that we need to do for the 2019 crop. But if we get any rebound, if you look at these kind of overbought, oversold indicators, if we kind of bounce back above and get up there toward that $4, it means we'd be going back up above your 50 and 100-day moving average, back toward that 200-day, and that would be a sign that, hey, this thing's got a little bit of strength. Now, a lot of times we make that little run here, and then people think, oh, we're going to make a jump up to 420. I don't think that's going to happen because the amount of corn that's out there in the Ukraine and Brazil and Argentina, it's going to put a cap on these markets because we're not going to be able to export it. So if we do get, finally get a day where we can get up here into this price range, you better have be ready, have your selling pants on and be ready to hit it. So what about 2020? This is the D's 2020 contract. When we hit that level back in October, we went back up to about 410. So we've been trending down in average prices here. So again, if you look back at somewhere in this range of relative strength within a February time frame, it's going to say somewhere over $4 again. It's not very optimistic outlook. I don't mean to be a bearer of bad news, but when I look at the big picture, and especially with those crops that are pretty decent in South America, we're going to have a hard time having any type of springtime rallies getting up back here to this 412 to 415. The highs last summer were in that 425 level, and that was a place when we were making maybe another increment of 2019 sales, be looking out into 2020. And back when we were in 2012, when that market ran up to 850 and there was a lot of uncertainty. Making sales out there in that summer when there was a lot of uncertainty in that current year, if you look ahead into those forward periods, that is a good thing to do as well. We always like to look ahead and be proactive in selling ahead of time. But if we do get a bounce back out of this 392 level back up into here, I've got an order sitting in there to sell, at 402 and 405 and 412, because I think that's going to be an area that's going to make some sense. Because when I look at that futures price today, I don't even think about the cash price. I'm just thinking about what my futures prices are. And I'm thinking, okay, if I sell $4 in the Dees and what the carry between Dees and March, that's probably going to be next year a 16-cent carry. Could be 416 against the March, and there'll probably be another maybe 10 cents a carry from the March to the May. 416 a dime would be 426. So I'm not thinking about cash harvest deliveries. I'm thinking about what this price is in the scheme of if I've got storage, what I can turn that $4 futures price into from a future standpoint by using carry. And then I think, okay, once I carry it away from harvest, my basis, instead of being 30 under at harvest time next year, maybe we can be 10 under as we get out into Jan, Feb, March, April, May. And I think then you could have some decent prices. So maybe we'll do something where this thing goes back up to those highs and exceeds it and goes up into the 450s. A lot of years we do that, but I'm going to still be focused on making sales in this January through May timeframe, regardless of where that goes. But anytime there's strength in there, we want to be hitting that. Now, soybeans, on that side of it, it's a little bit different than the corn. In the past, it used to be exactly like this. This is the corn pattern where you pin higher in the spring and run lower into the fall. It used to be, bean pattern used to be like that. We've had more demand from China late in the year, which has propelled prices higher. And we've also had more South American weather. So those two things have kind of shifted this seasonal period out here. Now, the last 2 years, our higher prices came in this February timeframe. And we've been using a lot of what they call short-dated options. You could buy a 980 put here a couple weeks ago for, 6 weeks ago for 25 cents, and you could sell like a 10-10 call for 12 and put, get a floor underneath your beans for about 12 cents out here in this time frame. To me, you're kind of ahead of your time frame, but when the market kind of goes above a moving average or it really kind of blows up, to me that's a price you want to be a little more aggressive using something like that. But most of our other futures positions we're going to try to get on will be out here a little bit later than our corn. And if you look at that actual corn chart, this is an older type style that they had, but the older chart on the corn pattern is just exactly like this here. 25% of the time you're here, run higher into the fall, the bullish pattern. But that's your predominant pattern really on corn. The bean ones up on March beans back to 960, which is, when you look at that in the scheme of where we've been the last year, and when you look at that in terms of where you get to be in the higher end of the range, be a place to be looking at beans. The only good thing is right now is that the levels are like 20, 25 under into a lot of the different processors around here right now. Novi beans, again, like I was saying, you could hit this 980 level here. Looking back, we had a pretty big washout, but anytime we get runs back toward 950 to 980, I think it's going to be a place to be looking at doing an increment of something there. If you look at soybean bullishness, negativity, we had that run up there right before in November, kind of that washout again here recently. We're starting to build back on the positivity into January. This is the most recent fund position on beans. They were getting short about 82,000 contracts. They got long here. They kind of went short again, kind of got back to neutral, and then boom, they've been selling off ahead again. But we're pretty negative in the big scheme of things when you look at beans or where they've been. And we're not as bearish as we were at that low when we went back down to $8, but quite a bit of negativity right now. So I guess I'd be holding off sales on beans right now. So big picture on the bean side, RJO, AgResource show those acres being up toward 85 million acres. And when you look down at that bottom line, our carryouts are going to be still right around 500 million bushels. Not as heavy as what it was here when we were up toward 1 billion. We've cut them in half, which should be more positive toward prices. But again, we've had a decent South American crop that's kind of keeping a cap on prices, even though these carryovers, they're not as heavy as they were, but it's keeping a cap on prices, even though the carryouts are coming down from where they were. Now they're back in line where we're here in 16-17 and 17-18. They're a little more heavy, but we're not nearly as tight as here when we had beans back up above 10 bucks, 10 to $11. But the big picture on beans is not real optimistic just because of the amount of acres that are going to be coming back in. And our exports, because of the China deal, are off. I mean, they're going to project, they're more optimistic about growth relative to on the beans than ag resources. So big picture-wise, you can see where we ballooned up to that billion bushel carryover. Those are the actual numbers. We were anticipating carryouts were going to be toward 1 billion. So we've cut that in half, which is good. Which if we do get some type of weather later in the year like I was talking about, that could give us a late season rally. But as we're sitting here right now, looking at those price projections, they're not, they're not $11 beans. It'd be a hope if we get back up toward 10. So we've got about 18 minutes to go here. So there's a couple different ideas I kind of want to talk about briefly. Brad Lubin over at the University of Nebraska has done a really good job of looking at the PLC versus ARC decisions. And basically, under stable and lower prices, the PLC is going to kick in before the ARC on corn. And if you look at those price projections that I was using where Ag Resource says $3 or RJ O'Brien says more toward $3.50, that PLC price, the reference price at $3.70 is going to kick in a lot quicker, and it's going to be a better payout than that ARC will be. I think it's a pretty easy decision when you look at the risk profile of next year, what the potential for having higher acres and lower prices of that PLC is going to be the way to go. I mean, I'm sticking on my head, a little bit there, making a market projection and making a prediction about farm programs. And I would tell Brad, and I'll tell anybody this, to me, this ARC PLC thing, in terms of the complexity of it and having farmers make a prediction about market prices involved in their farm payouts is craziness. I used to do a lot of research when I was in grad school on farm programs, and we were tending towards simplicity, and this thing has become, from where we were in 2012 and this farm bill is very complicated. This year is easier because a PLC decision is a much easier decision point. But trying to make a decision on your farm programs based on a market prediction, in my mind, is heresy. But anyway, that was my editorial comment for the day. But so looking at the ARC on the bean side has some merit, especially in eastern Nebraska, where you would have more volatility in yields and potentially your county could be below. Those yields could drop and you'd have a revenue component in there. There's some interest. It seemed like there's a lot of interest for people looking at that. But I guess one of the things, I'm going to slide through this because a lot of you, well, I'll just go over it real quick here. Updating your yields on the PLC. If you have where your actual yields will drop below, this is Saunders County, drop below your county yields, they'll actually substitute in the county, 75% of the county yield. But what we've seen is a lot of these eastern Nebraska yields, APHs have gone up quite a bit in these years of good crops. We've had a lot of moisture, and so our APHs have jumped quite a bit. There's probably a pretty, almost certain that you'd be able to update your PLC over here in eastern Nebraska and have an advantage there. Irrigated country, it's not as definite that you're going to update your yields, where we've had a little more yield volatility and maybe not as good as yields as what we've had in the eastern side of the state. But to me, there's a pretty good chance you're going to be able to update that PLC price in the eastern side of the state. Again, that decision, when you look at those prices, the numbers from the Congressional Budget Office, USDA, FAPRI out of University of Missouri, I mean, they've got projections all the way out here. They don't show a whole lot of variation in prices, which the world never ever stays that consistent. So trying to put my hope in these projections, I think I'm more worried about what those commercials are seeing out there because they got a lot of money at stake in this thing. The government does too, but the commercials are worried about how are we going to trade this thing. So their projections of prices being down here in that lower end of the range, I think prompts me to be more inclined to go to that PLC decision. Got to see what I got here. Okay, this is what I wanted to talk about in terms of marketing your average price and what could happen with this PLC price for this year. This is from K-State University. I keep referring to K-State and Iowa State and Illinois. They've got really good websites where they've got a lot of really good, useful information on their farm doc. University of Illinois is really good. Iowa State site's really good too. But what's going on right now, we're 1, 2, 3, basically 4 months into this marketing your average price. K-State didn't have their update. But for this month right here, the basis was actually running about 12 cents. The actual futures price was about 368. Typically, the basis, if you look back at NAS average price received, National Ag Statistics, that basis is running about 20 cents under. Right now, it's running 12 cents over. So that 368.12 gave us a 380 price. So they're marketing your average price for this year is about 380, and that PLC reference price is at 370. There probably won't be a payout this year on this PLC. But if you run into next year, if we go back to a more typical basis pattern, and that thing goes to more 20 under, and say if we're at 350 on a futures, you could have a 330 cash price relative to that marketing, relative to that PLC reference price. You could be, if it's a 330 with 370 reference, you could be a 40-cent payout on that PLC deal. To me, that could be a pretty significant payment. And really, you've got a free put underneath your crop at 370. Now, this year is kind of convoluted because, which, thank the Lord, we've got that good a basis and it's making that thing positive and it's really good for our cash markets. But from a free put from the government, it's kind of raised that, it's put that cash price up above your PLC, and it's not giving you any downside protection per se. So, but next year, I think that if we go back to a more normal basis pattern because of a bigger crop, this thing gives you, so to me, from a risk standpoint, from risk reward, this thing could really help you if this thing really goes, if we do have a big drop in prices. So this year, it's not looking like you're going to have a PLC payment based on their projections because the basis looks to stay strong all the way through here. And I think that thing will definitely give you some support into next year if we would go back to a really negative price scenario. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't be marketing ahead of time and doing some things, but this gives you some added backdrop or backstop in the event that prices really get out of hand and go lower, which is a good federal farm program. I mean that gives you a backstop in case things really go south, which is what it should do. Soybean side of it, again, when you look at that reference price of 840 and where prices are running, it doesn't look like we'll get paid out on that one either. So if you want to look at those deals, I know you got to make a decision within 1 month from today on PRC or PLC, ARC. The Farm Doc website, you can go in, you can log in, you can get a password, and you can go in and run some different scenarios to look at this stuff. This is for Cass County, non-irrigated corn, low forecast model price with the 160 PLC yield. In there, they're showing that your PLC payments will be up towards $60 in 2019, which I think that basis kind of messes this up a little bit because obviously we're not going to have that big of a payment. But looking into 2020, they're showing that PLC price structure paying $60 an acre versus the ARC County at 20. Going forward, the other good thing is you'll be able to switch that after next year and be able to make a decision. If something changes dramatically, you'd be able to go make a change back to ARC if you wanted to. But when you look at those low price projections, you can kind of see what that model is going to show you. If you look at a CBO projection, those things, they come down, they're lower, but the spread between, I think, the two increases on that next year, it shows more of a $24 payment, using that PLC payment or the PLC program. And then this was a high price scenario, and then the payments even drop even more, obviously, because you move further away from that PLC reference price. I didn't put up the soybean ones, but the soybean ones actually show a slight payment, for the ARC under soybeans, where the PLC one doesn't. So you probably want to look at those individually, but where you go look at that thing, it's called Gardner Program Payment Calculator from Bruce Gardner, famous ag economist from the University of Maryland, brilliant ag policy professor, and baby's named after him. Unfortunately, he passed away here about 3 years ago, but this thing's, you can go in there and log in, and you can kind of run those through there. It's a little bit easier than the Texas A&M model that's out there. But again, if you want the website, it's right up there. But it's underneath that Farm Doc. If you Google their website, that's where you can find it, or call me. I can help you find it. You get a username and get logged in there and kind of run some scenarios. So I'm going to run through some crop insurance stuff. We work a lot with crop insurance in our company. From a risk management standpoint, we also sell crop insurance. But 2018, basically, the insurance, the Nebraska Department of Insurance is kind of making their rates kind of come together on hail. It's not such a big issue here, but out west we got massive risk from hail. If we're irrigated, our bigger risk out there is hail or wind loss. But the final average loss costs, the FALCs, the Nebraska Department of Insurance has basically made everybody in 2019 be plus or 25% of that. Next year within about 15% of that. And so they've imposed more consistency in terms of crop insurance private products in Nebraska. Iowa's been that way before. They've enforced that in Nebraska to be a little bit more like Iowa, which I think has reduced some of the competition between the companies in terms of the private hail offerings, and it's raised the rates. But that's one of the big things that changed this last year. From our company standpoint, we look at hail production plans, kind of look at how that pairs with your multi-peril crop insurance and looking at your modified APH and using that hail product in an enterprise situation with the enterprise multi-peril, which works well with the enterprise side of it because you drop down your multi-peril costs and use that private product to go with it. We always look at that, how it compares to a basic product, a Comp 2 product, an HPP 120 product. Our families all have farms and we use this on there because we got skin in the game. We want to find out a way is how do we get the cost of that insurance down but protect us against a lot of wind and hail issues. And so we look at this stuff from a user side of it, but also trying to help our clients minimize their costs and have adequate coverage. But that hail production plan is a good way to look at it and couples well. And that's something that came out about 5 years ago. And so if you haven't looked at these things, you should, because they're really cost effective and they give you very good coverage, especially out in the irrigated areas out west. And the other thing that we do is we look at all the different companies and see what those rates are per 100 and how the multi-peril compares, but also which insurance company that we write with to kind of keep those costs in check. So standard disclaimers, we can't predict where the future is going to go, but that's kind of how we think in our group. And probably the thing that I didn't cover a lot on slides was cash markets in terms of what's going on in Nebraska. Because we're trading that every day, I guess I kind of want to open it up. We got about 5 minutes to go. Is that right, Tyler? Maybe just open it up for any questions you had about any of the previous stuff that I had, or if you got like things you want to pick my brain on the cash markets from a basis standpoint. Anybody have any questions? Yes?
A lot of us still have dryland milo bases. Aren't counties still going to work for milo?
That's a tough question, Larry. You've got the base, the milo base, and the payout on that. I haven't looked at that closely enough to make a good comment. I think the payout on it is pretty good, isn't it? I haven't looked at it close enough. I would call my buddy Brad Lubin and ask him. He's the guy that knows the details of that. And Tyler, did you give one of the presentations that Brad used with the ARC PLC?
Yeah, Brad was here and did one of these. Larry, you might not have been here, but I and correct me. I thought that he was talking about was PLC was better on Milo, but I could be wrong. So I don't know. But just I'm a meteorologist, right? I'm more wrong than him. So.
No, well, probably just from the price projections on corn and bean, or in terms of where the corn price could potentially go. I could take a look at it. I could throw it into that calculator too and see how it kicks out. But it's a good question because it's.
What can we do to protect ourselves on basis? I mean, if we go to the processors, we do very good on basis, but what if co-ops aren't passing that on to us?
That's the real quandary for farmers, that if you don't have storage and you can't carry it away from the marketplace, so for me, working with a farmer that's going off you can't protect yourself. I mean, DTN had a cash grain index that they tried to get going where you could conceivably have maybe bought back that cash grain index, but the volume in it was no good because there's no interest in it because nobody would take the other side of it. So there's got to be like a fertilizer market. Why don't we have an anhydrous market? Well, there's not the two sides to make the market and the bid ask that you can do it. And so that cash grain index never took off of. And so that's basically how Farmers Cooperative stays open, 20 hours a day during harvest so you can get in there. I mean, they're there for you all the time, but their basis levels are going to reflect that. Why does Frontier Co-op at Waverly run a 70 under basis right now when ADM Lincoln's a 20 under, a 50-cent spread? It's it's not fair, but it's not fair to a farmer, but it's also, you got to have them be in business. And that's how, when we talk about grain markets, everybody always thinks that, okay, well, they're out to, maybe to get me, or they're going to buy that at that cheap price because they know it's going higher. Their deal as an elevator is always to buy on basis at a discount to the futures. And they're going to take that and buy it as low as they can. I mean, they're in business to make money. And so a lot of times people, it's like, oh, Cargill or, ADM or whatever that is. I mean, they've got to be there. They're our marketing partners. They got to be in business for us to work with. But their goal is always, from a margin standpoint, Jim Kendrick, it's always a margin, dummy. Wake up, it's the margin. They're always focused on the, I'm not saying that to your dummy. He would always say that to me. But it was always like, you know what I mean? So he would always argue about those margins. And they're always trying to buy that basis as wide as they can. And they'll go out and hedge the carry, and they carry through that market. So beans are a great example this year. So they were 70 under at ADM at harvest time. The basis was wide, and the carry in the market between the November beans to the March beans was 25 cents. So if you had a 25 cent of futures carry and a 70 under basis, that price at harvest was basically 70 plus 25 is basically 95 cents underneath the March board. What is it today at ADM? It's 20 cents. So it's improved 75 cents or 5 cents on that basis. And that's how, so now Farmers Cooperative and Frontier, they were buying those beans and putting them in storage with the idea, now didn't matter darn bit what futures did, because they hedged. The minute somebody sold them a bean, they hedged 5,000 bushels. Or if they bought 20,000, they hedged it. Now they're just worried about that basis improvement. But that basis improvement, year in and year out. Now last year, the basis, because of the bigger crops, the basis didn't improve as much, as quick. But if that seasonal pattern is high in the spring, goes lower in the fall, those basis levels improve like that. I mean, that's how Jim Kendrick preached that 50 years ago. I mean, in terms of, that's how he trained all these merchandisers that work at Midwest or Frontier Co-op and Farmers Cooperative, and all these people were working at Bunge and ADM, and that's how they manage their risk. But it's on basis. And my argument is, as a farmer, if you're going to be good at marketing, you better manage your basis, and you better manage that carry the same way the big co-ops. If you want to have your farm act like Cargill or act like Bunge, and do that. So trying to predict the futures is tough. I mean, that's the hardest thing you're going to do. ADM doesn't have to do that because they hedge every bushel. They don't worry about it. They're just managing margins. But as a farmer, you are on the harder game because you got to pick a futures price. You don't know if it's going up or down. Now, basis and carry, yeah, you can get good at managing that stuff. That stuff's like riding a bike. My argument is you need to sell some corn ahead of time and beans ahead of time and lock in a futures price. But that basis, that's how they make their money, and that's why it's so stinking wide, is because they gotta buy it and then move it on. But in the market where we were 70 under, I mean, you had an idea, like last year, the bean basis popped back pretty good, but they're gonna try to buy it as wide as they can. But if you gotta be a seller at harvest time, it is tough. I mean, you can benefit by selling ahead of time, maybe doing some cash marketing ahead of time, but if you gotta deliver at harvest time, it's pretty dang tough from an overall standpoint. And that's what you're competing with on a farm, is if you have storage or don't have storage, that's the hard thing. If you're selling at harvest time, it's a tough game right now. The margins they stink. That's the only way to put it in a kind way. But so that's why, I don't even know what your original question was. I got on a little bit of a rant there. So, but that, yeah. Any other questions? No. Yeah, Scott.
Yeah, a little more on the basis. It's been below for a long time on both the corn and the beans.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're seeing some positive in corn.
You bet.
What's going on there? Why is it positive?
Great question. And so the quick answer is that a year ago, when they estimated the crop, they probably underestimated the crop. I think they also underestimated feed use. And so last year we had a really cold, wet winter, and cattle feeding margins were terrible. We fed a lot more corn to get the output of cattle that we needed. So when we got down into the summer, there was less corn out there. And I think USDA, when that March number, they had the stocks 300 million bushels above the guess, and then last September they came in 300 million bushels below the guess. So I think USDA is having a really hard time quantify it. The things they can counter, ethanol exports and corn exports, but they survey farmers and commercials about how much grain's on hand, but that feed numbers are kind of the number they can't count. They can't survey it. And so that basis is telling you there's less corn out there, less beans out there than what the government's probably telling you. The other thing that's going on now, is it as tight? Are we in a situation that, I mean, nobody's moving corn right now because the futures price is low, so they also tighten up. We even did that last year when we had kind of a lower price scenario and nobody was moving cash corn, so they had to tighten up the basis to get corn to move. So part of that's just a function of low futures price, and we got to tighten up basis to make it move through. But this year, not as much corn up in South Dakota, and Vermilion, and then you don't have as much corn out in Indiana and Ohio. So when you look at the freight rates, it's advantageous to take corn out of that southern Illinois, southern Indiana range down into the Texas feedlots. If you had corn that was up in Vermilion and north that flows out of that northern market down to Blair and down to Council Bluffs and down toward Columbus, the two big ethanol plants in the state. So you've got that I-80 tier there where they're fighting for corn tooth and nail to keep. They don't want to let it get on the rail, and they can't get their bids high enough to pull that corn down from northern Nebraska. That there's corn up there, but that corn's staying up to feed those ethanol plants in southern Indiana, South Dakota, and kind of just east over there in Indiana, or excuse me, Iowa. So there's this big battle between the rail loaders, the ethanol plants, and the export market. Like the Council Bluffs market's got Bartlett grain sitting over there, and they're exporting corn to Mexico and down to the Texas feedlots. So we've got a lot of competition for our corn this year, which is great. Is it because the crop, is it because those numbers are overall down and we're really short of the crop? That's what we're trying to figure out. But our basis levels last year showed that, hey, we don't have as much corn around. There's not as many grain piles around, and we're sitting there. So that's favorable that maybe we're not quite as heavy as what they're showing, what the USDA numbers are. But that's the question that right now we're all trying to grapple with. Because you got ADM today, for example. Am I running too long here? Or,
They can leave if they want.
okay. So, but the ADM market right now today, they were 5 over, and around Christmas time, they got to like 10, 11 over, and some days there they're paying $4 cash corn. But so CVA went out, bought a bunch of corn for about 12 under. I think they loaded some of their rail loaders up there, and I think they're scooting trains into Columbus right now. So basis kind of it's going to firm up in Feb, March, April as everybody starts going to the field. Well, I think they loaded up on a few train loads so they can scoot those into Columbus, and so the basis is kind of backed off there a little bit. So they want to try to buy cheaper corn basis, but Blair yesterday had kind of gone off to 0, and then they firmed back up to 3 over. So there's that cat and mouse there going on right now, which to me, I think will still get firmer as we go into March and should get really interesting in April, May, and then kind of have to see what the weather looks like. But for us, it's beautiful. I mean, to have that strong a basis right now, I think Wood River, for example, is 3 over, 5 over, 7 over, 10 over. Some of these ethanol plants have more storage, but they've got, some of them are a little shorter and don't have as much forward coverage, and they got to come in and push up the basis. So anytime we get jumps up there, we're 5 over. Like E-Energy down at Adams is what, 3 under and 0 down that way, which is unheard of. So it's awesome. If you sell ahead of time and work with your basis later and you got storage, it works really well. So, yes?
You got 2 million more acres projected. Where's these acres come from?
Let me roll back to, let me roll back to real quick. Yeah, it is. That's a good point. Let's see if I can throw that back up there real quick. I glossed over that slide. So they had that, Ag Resource had that in there. They show cotton acres actually dropping, 2 million, and they show wheat actually dropping a little bit. Those acre numbers on wheat are as low as what they were like my granddad was born in 1900. We haven't had those numbers that low. Last year was the second lowest number, I think, since 1908. So I mean, dropping down that low. So the big jump is you're going to get jumping up to that 94, 96 type level. Wheat is where a lot of that's coming from. I mean, you've got that drop in there. You're dropping 5 million acres there. We had cotton back up toward 12. We're down maybe 2 from where we were a few years ago. But our CRP numbers have dropped. So we've lost that in some of those other areas.
They go by FSA records from the prior year because nobody's ever called me up and said, hey, Al, what are you doing?
Yeah, they do a survey, And then I know they might not have called you, but I know and I know other people call, and I don't know what kind of, what they tell the government when they do it. But USDA's looked at these numbers over a lot of years, and so they know that when they kind of clean up their data and look at that. So this stuff here is more like looking at ag resources, strictly looking at corn bean returns and saying the corn returns, and people are going to tend to go back toward corn back in the eastern corn belt, which that kind of mystifies me a little bit because we had a lot more corn planted versus beans last year. When it all ended up, and I thought maybe we'd kind of shift back because 2 years ago we were more in that. I'd have to go back and look and see what those CRP, but I know the rates are attractive on CRP relative to corn and bean margins right now. We're looking at our own farm moving out of some production and going back into it, have more cattle. So, but that's pretty negative, I know. But that's kind of the numbers everybody's got in their head, and that's why we're kind of struggling to get back up above $4. So whether it's right or not wrong, we'll kind of see as we go into the spring planting period. And I think Al's comment about the El Nino, kind of La Nina pattern, we've been like Australia's been really dry for the last 5 years. El Nino, we've been really wet here. Eastern Nebraska's had tremendous crops, dryland crops relative to the APHs, and those have improved. But so it'll bear out watching, how that weather pattern kind of shapes in there. So, I mean, things can change. That's probably one of the things I want to say. Futures markets can change. So in terms of, that's an idea in terms of what those price parameters could be. But obviously the futures market is going to be volatile going forward. That's why it's hard to predict what the futures are going to do. I'd rather focus on basis, carry, if we do incremental sales, kind of focus on those things, and maybe use some options if we're uncertain about where we're going to go in the future. Any other questions? I appreciate everybody asking questions. It's good to have that interaction, and I'd be happy to answer any other questions here after you get done. Our group's based here, like I said, in Lincoln, Nebraska. If you ever want to reach out to us, feel free to do that. You go to our website. We do some stuff on social media, on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. We do like a morning minute comment 3-4 times a week. It's got try to be quick and informative, I think, on that. But if you have any questions about what we do or how we do things, please feel free to reach out to us. So we're here and we focus on Nebraska and about 200 miles of here.
Okay. Well, let's thank Doug for coming in. And thank you all for coming. Appreciate it. Had another good series. You notice the agenda has the evaluation on the front, but also have some season or series whole questions kind of on the back, if you wouldn't mind throwing down your thoughts on that. And you can just leave them where you're sitting, or you can throw them at the back. Grab a cupcake if you forgot that's Valentine's Day for your spouse or significant other. Grab a cupcake and say you made cupcake for them. But yeah, take some of that stuff so we don't have to eat it all. But again, thanks all for coming. Appreciate it. Feel free to hang around and chat and ask questions, whatever you might need. But thanks again to not only this week's sponsor, Farm Bureau, but all of our other sponsors, Bayer, Sayre, Climate Field View, and Corn Board for putting this together. And then again for our speakers and Doug here today. So thanks and safe travels.